Hey, it's Mr. Ballin here. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series. Whether you're new to Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body. In the winter of 2022, a mom in her mid-30s sat in the bleachers at the local ice hockey rink, cheering on her 6-year-old son. She always enjoyed watching these hockey games. The kids were adorable as they slipped around the ice, trying to control the hockey puck. Her son was small for his age. He was so tiny, she almost hadn't signed him up for the team again this year. But he loved hockey and his teammates, so she didn't have the heart to say no. The mom clapped and hollered when her son got the puck and started skating toward the opposite goal. Then he swung his stick and the puck went sailing past the other team's goalie. Her son threw his arms up in celebration, and then he suddenly crumpled to the ice in pain. Fear ran through the mother as she heard her son's wail. Nobody had touched him. All he'd done was swing a stick and raise his arms. But he was crying so hard, it was like he'd broken a bone or cracked his head open on the ice. The referee skated over to the boy to see what was wrong as the mother raced down the bleachers to her son's side. She didn't know if she should call him an ambulance or just tell him to snap out of it. But judging from how loud he was screaming, the pain he was feeling was very real. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So if you like today's story, the next time you're in the Follow Button's house, secretly replace all the pictures hanging up on their walls with a slice of square cheese. This episode is called 17 Doctors. During the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020, Caroline Daniels stood in her backyard in suburban Iowa, watching her husband, Brian, blow up a small bouncy house that she just bought on Amazon. Brian had nearly gotten the thing inflated. They'd all been cooped up in the house for over a month because of the pandemic, so it was a godsend that the weather was nice and they'd gotten something fun for the kids to do outside. The moment the bouncy house was inflated, Andrew and Robin went running to it and piled inside with their dad. They screamed and giggled as their father bounced around them, launching them a few feet into the air every time. Caroline smiled and went back into the kitchen, where their nanny was cutting up some veggie sticks for a snack. She was about to grab a knife and help when the screaming outside turned from fun to painful. Caroline dashed back outside and found her husband kneeling next to Andrew. The little 4-year-old was curled up on his side, sobbing with pain. Caroline helped Brian scoop Andrew into his arms, then followed them inside. Brian laid Andrew on the sofa in the living room so that he and Caroline could try to figure out if the boy had any broken bones. But after a minute of prodding, Caroline felt sure that nothing was seriously wrong. Besides, Brian assured her that Andrew hadn't landed hard or anything. He just bounced a little, then started screaming. This whole situation definitely seemed odd, but Caroline assumed that, he must have just landed at an odd angle or something. She gave him some Motrin to help with the pain, and after a few minutes, Andrew did calm down. And by dinner time, he was back to his usual happy-go-lucky self. By the following morning, Caroline had put the whole bouncy house incident out of her mind. She left Brian watching the kids while she hopped on a morning Zoom call for work. Halfway through the call, though, Caroline heard a piercing scream in the yard. It was Andrew again. She turned off her camera and raced downstairs. By the time she got to the backyard, the nanny was kneeling beside Andrew, who was once again in the fetal position and crying. Caroline asked if Andrew had fallen down, but the nanny said no. He was just standing there, and then he suddenly yelped and fell to the ground, and Andrew had been crying ever since. Caroline couldn't tell if Andrew was truly in pain or if he was just having a meltdown. She picked up her son and asked what was wrong, but it was clear he was in no mood to talk. He just cried. Caroline wasn't sure what to make of it. Andrew was not the kind of little boy to throw temper tantrums, but she also knew that every child gets overwhelmed sometimes. Besides, he hadn't seen his friends in months because of the COVID lockdown, and he was tired of being at home all the time, and so Caroline decided he must just be having a moment. Still, she gave him another Motrin, and about 15 minutes later, Andrew was back to normal. It suddenly occurred to Caroline that Andrew's molars might be coming in, which could be extremely painful. Once he was outside playing with the nanny again, she picked up the phone to call his dentist. A few weeks later, an orthodontist named Dr. Tyson Graham sat down on a stool in his treatment room and turned to face little Andrew, who was sitting up in the examination chair. Andrew's mom was in the corner, looking anxious. Dr. Graham smiled at her, then explained to Andrew how he was going to try to help the little boy with the pain he'd been experiencing lately. Andrew's regular dentist had already taken x-rays of Andrew's mouth and found that Andrew had been grinding his teeth at night. Teeth grinding can cause difficulty breathing at night, and the dentist thought that might explain why Andrew had been so moody and exhausted recently. He wasn't sleeping well. So the dentist had referred Andrew to Dr. Graham, thinking that the orthodontist might find a way to prevent the boy's teeth grinding. But as Dr. Graham examined Andrew's mouth, he found a different issue. Andrew's palate, the roof of his mouth, was too narrow for his age. In Dr. Graham's opinion, that, not teeth grinding, was what was making it difficult for Andrew to breathe at night. He turned to Caroline and explained that if Andrew had a wider palate, he'd very likely feel better. They could put an expander in Andrew's mouth for a couple of months to push the palate out. Caroline looked nervous, but Dr. Tyson explained that the expander wasn't that different from getting braces, and it would definitely help Andrew breathe better. Caroline still looked unsure, but she agreed. Dr. Graham nodded and then went to get a few supplies to install the palate expander. A month later, Caroline squeezed into the bathroom with Andrew and Robin, squirting little dabs of bubblegum toothpaste onto their toothbrushes. Then all three of them brushed their teeth together, a little bedtime routine they'd fallen into recently. Mostly, this was so Caroline could make sure they actually did it, but it was also to make sure Andrew used the special mouthwash she had bought him to keep his palate expander nice and clean. Caroline was tired, and she could tell her kids were exhausted too. They'd spent all day outside, playing a socially distanced version of hide-and-seek they'd made up with the neighborhood kids. Caroline was glad to see Andrew back to his old self. It seemed like the palate expander had really worked. As the kids got into their pajamas, Andrew asked if his mother would measure them against the doorframe in their bedroom. Caroline smiled. She had been marking their heights there since they were old enough to stand. Robin chimed in that she wanted to be measured too. Caroline knew why there was suddenly all this interest in being measured. The neighborhood kids had been bragging about how tall they'd gotten, so of course her kids wanted to know too. Caroline told Robin to stand against the door jamb and carefully marked her height with a pencil. When Robin stepped away, it looked like she had grown a full inch since they'd last measured her. Caroline wrote the date on the jamb as Robin grinned. Then it was Andrew's turn. But after she measured him and Andrew stepped away, it looked like he had barely grown at all. Andrew frowned, looking at his sister's mark with a tinge of jealousy. Caroline assured him he would grow by next month, but she knew this was unusual for a 4-year-old kid. He should be growing like a weed, and so she decided she would make an appointment with the pediatrician in the morning, just to make sure nothing was wrong. But later that week, Caroline felt frustrated as she paced her kitchen, listening while Andrew's pediatrician explained over the phone that Andrew was not growing because of the pandemic. The stress of all the isolation and fear was negatively affecting Andrew's growth, and unfortunately, because they were still in the pandemic, there really wasn't much they could do. They should just wait it out for a few months. But as she hung up the phone, she felt certain that something was wrong with Andrew, and it had nothing to do with COVID-19. In early 2021, about 9 months after Andrew first started experiencing these sudden bouts of extreme pain, Caroline took him back to his pediatrician for a follow-up. She let Andrew walk ahead of her into the office. She intentionally trailed behind him a little so she could watch his stride. she saw he was dragging his left foot instead of picking it up and actually stepping with it. He'd been doing this whole past week. It was like his right foot was doing all the walking and his left foot was just along for the ride. At this point, it was another symptom to add to the list. Over the past few months, Andrew had been having headaches and meltdowns again. Besides that, he seemed exhausted all the time. The Motrin still helped somewhat, but Caroline could see him getting more solemn and less playful with each passing day. She knew her baby was in pain, and it had to be due to something other than his narrow palate or the pandemic. Caroline had taken him to several doctors, trying to get some answers. A neurologist had told her that Andrew had migraines, while an ear, nose, and throat doctor still believed her son was having breathing issues while sleeping, and so he likely couldn't fall into a deep, undisturbed sleep, which explained why he was so tired. But to Caroline, none of these doctors were addressing the root problem. She felt like each doctor was focusing on one single symptom, but nobody was taking a step back to see the whole picture. What was the underlying condition or disease that was causing all these symptoms? And until somebody could put all the puzzle pieces together, Andrew would be the one suffering. But no matter how many times she tried to communicate this with all the doctors and specialists, it was like nobody seemed to understand. Caroline felt like she was losing her mind, but all she could do was just keep going to more doctors. And so she'd taken Andrew back to his pediatrician's office, hoping maybe he might finally have a real answer for her. While the pediatrician measured Andrew's height and weight, Caroline went through all of Andrew's symptoms. She expected the doctor to offer some kind of overarching explanation. Instead, he just stood upright and told her there was good news. Andrew had grown a bit since his last appointment. Caroline supposed that was good, but the rest of Andrew's symptoms showed no improvement whatsoever. And on the whole, Andrew wasn't feeling good. He was still in pain. And now there was this lazy foot issue. She wanted to know how they could start actively helping her son instead of just tracking all his symptoms. The pediatrician suggested that Caroline put her son in physical therapy to correct his foot imbalance. He promised to write a referral. Caroline thanked him, though secretly she felt overwhelmed by how many appointments this would likely add to their already doctor-heavy calendar. But it just felt like there was nothing else she could do. She had to go through with it. So she smiled and promised the doctor she would get Andrew into therapy soon. Later that week, while Andrew was going through his physical therapy routine, Caroline, who was in the room watching him, felt uneasy. Andrew's therapist, Miss Ashley, was walking Andrew through an examination. Caroline smiled as Andrew walked around the room with a determined look on his face. Miss Ashley took notes and told him he was doing a great job. Then Miss Ashley asked him to sit cross-legged on the floor. Andrew tried, but he couldn't quite get his legs to cross over one another. One leg would bend, but he couldn't bend his other leg enough to sit upright. Before long, he got frustrated and told Miss Ashley he couldn't do it. Miss Ashley said that was okay, and then they moved on to other activities. After his session was over, Andrew came running over to his mom, and Caroline scooped him up. She let him rest his head on her shoulder, and then Miss Ashley came over and explained that Andrew might have a congenital condition called Chiari malformation. That's when a part of the brain, called the cerebellum, bulges through an opening at the back of the skull, right where the skull joins the spinal canal. The bulge puts pressure on the cerebellum and the spinal cord. It can cause severe headaches, scoliosis, and sleep apnea, which is when breathing becomes interrupted during sleep. If Andrew did have a Chiari malformation, he could need surgery. The thought sent a shiver through Caroline. She never thought that Andrew might need to be cut open. She hated picturing it, and she had no idea how she was going to explain it to him. The following winter, in 2022, Caroline was in Andrew's bedroom helping him into his pajamas, the same pair of red flannel pajamas that he'd been wearing for 2 years now. It felt like his sister Robin outgrew her clothes every few months, but Andrew hadn't needed new pajamas or t-shirts since before COVID. Andrew was 6 years old now, but he still looked like he was closer to 4, and this evening he was throwing a tantrum like a bona fide toddler. But Caroline didn't blame him. After dinner, she and Brian had taken Andrew out for ice cream and broke the news. Because of what was going on with him, he had to quit his hockey team. The skating was causing too much pain in his knees and back. It was just too much for his underdeveloped body. At first, Caroline just felt heartbroken for making Andrew so sad. But now, she was so frustrated she was becoming angry at all the doctors. She was tired of having to tell Andrew that nobody knew why his body was failing him. The latest theory, that Andrew had Chiari malformation, wasn't right either. Andrew had tested negative for the condition last year. Since then, Caroline and Brian had taken their son to countless more specialists. A new pediatrician for a second opinion, a pediatric internist, even an adult internist, just in case they found something different. In total, Andrew had seen 17 different doctors over the last 3 years. But all those doctors were still stuck in a cycle of treating his symptoms individually. Caroline finally got Andrew into bed, though it broke her heart to leave him red-faced and tear-streaked, his little arms wrapped around his favorite stuffed animal. She went downstairs and started scrolling on her phone just to decompress. A Facebook friend had posted an article that looked interesting about a new artificial intelligence software called ChatGPT. You could ask it any question, no matter how complex, and it would scan the whole internet in a matter of seconds to generate an answer. People were using it to create marketing plans for their companies, to write blog posts, and to make mashups like fairy tales written in the style of a mafia movie, or resignation letters if they were written by famous TV characters. It seemed like a fun way to spend an hour, so Caroline started messing around with ChatGPT. When Brian came into the living room and sat down next to her on the sofa, she read him some of the funniest mashups it had made. Brian laughed and then joked that she should try to use it to diagnose Andrew. Caroline laughed dismissively, but then she wondered. It was a long shot, but why not? Maybe ChatGPT would find some rare, obscure disease that most specialists had never heard of. Or maybe it would unearth some clue, some pivotal question to ask that would help one of his doctors see the whole picture. The worst that could happen was nothing, really. So Caroline started typing all of Andrew's symptoms into ChatGPT. She even went and got her copy of medical notes from an MRI he'd gotten and typed them in, line by line. It was a tedious process, especially doing it on her phone, but eventually when she was done, she hit enter and waited. A few moments later, the little text box started suggesting possible answers, but they were all conditions that Andrew had already been tested for. Caroline's heart sank. She felt stupid for thinking this brand new internet AI chat box could magically diagnose her child, but then she realized she actually had left out one of his symptoms, the fact that he could no longer sit cross-legged. She told ChatGPT to redo the search, including that symptom, and within moments, it suggested a condition that she'd never heard of, and none of Andrew's doctors had ever mentioned it either. But as she started reading the symptoms of this condition aloud, Brian sat up straight, his eyes going wide. He ran to get his laptop, and Caroline started researching on her phone. Eventually, she found a Facebook group for families living with and caring for those with this condition, and to her surprise, their stories were nearly identical to Andrew's. A week later, Caroline was bursting with anticipation as she sat next to Andrew in a brand new doctor's office. They were waiting to see Dr. Hannah Gordon, a pediatric neurosurgeon. Caroline had brought a packet of research with her and had it waiting on her lap for when the doctor came in. She hoped that by the end of the appointment, Dr. Gordon would be able to officially diagnose Andrew and that Caroline would finally know what was wrong with her son. When Dr. Gordon finally came into the exam room, Caroline introduced herself and explained that usually she was not one to surf the internet and self-diagnose. But she'd actually found some compelling evidence online, and then she handed over the research packet she'd compiled and she watched the doctor read over it. When Dr. Gordon laid eyes on Andrew's MRI scans, she smiled and told Caroline that she was fairly certain she did know how to help Andrew. Dr. Gordon explained that Andrew was suffering from a condition called tethered cord syndrome, the same condition that ChatGPT had identified. The spinal cord runs like a cable through the bones that make up the spine, from the base of the skull to the tailbone. However, in rare cases, the spinal cord improperly attaches itself to something inside the bones of the spinal column. As a result, the spinal cord's movement is limited. In short, it gets stuck. Andrew's spinal cord was stuck to one of those growing spinal bones, causing him extreme pain and all his other symptoms. It was also why he couldn't sit cross-legged, a symptom that's so common among people with tethered cord syndrome that ChatGPT recognized the pattern. Caroline believes that ChatGPT was able to diagnose Andrew because it was doing the very thing she had spent years asking doctors to do. It took a step back and considered all of Andrew's symptoms, instead of picking and choosing or focusing on them one by one. Luckily for Andrew, he was able to undergo surgery to detach his spinal cord from where it was stuck. Once the tension was gone, Andrew's symptoms soon disappeared, and he went back to his happy-go-lucky self. For real this time. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories. They are all inspired by true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lamb. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our senior managing producer is Nick Ryan. And our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Bytak and Tasia Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Samantha Collins. Production support by Avery Siegel. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and also Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery. Hey, it's Mr. Ballin here. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series. Whether you're new to Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body. In 1944, a doctor covered a deceased patient's body with a sheet and then wheeled their stretcher out into the hallway. The morgue at the Oregon State Hospital was already full, so the doctor planned to put this body in the chapel. But when he pushed open the chapel doors, there were already so many stretchers with dead patients with sheets on them inside that there was no room for this patient. The doctor closed the chapel's heavy wooden doors and just stood there, his mind racing. More than 400 patients had fallen violently ill in the past 12 hours, and dozens had died. The doctor had no idea what the cause was, and if he couldn't figure it out, he knew more bodies would be joining the ones already lining the inside of the chapel. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you liked today's story, please invite the follow button on an African safari, but before you go, make sure you sneak 27 raw steaks into their backpack. This week's story is called Blood Feast. It was late in the afternoon on November 18th, 1942. A cook named Mickey McKillop opened the lid of a giant metal vat, then asked his volunteer sous chef, 27-year-old George Nosen, to carry it over to an industrial oven. Mickey and George were starting to prepare dinner for almost 500 patients across 5 wards at the Oregon State Hospital, a public mental facility for psychiatric patients. Tonight's menu was scrambled egg yolks and toast, and Mickey, along with his boss, Mary O'Hare, were the only 2 cooks on duty. The hospital had been understaffed for a year now, ever since the United States entered World War II. Many members of the nursing staff had left to volunteer for the war effort. During the day, there was about one attendant for every 16 patients, but at night, that number swelled to one attendant for every 150 patients. Mickey and Mary were so desperate for help in the kitchen that they had started asking trustworthy patients to help them prep for each meal. And one of those trustworthy patients was Mickey's volunteer sous chef, George Nosen. George placed a frozen 16-pound canister of eggs onto the countertop beside the oven. Mickey liked George, and he felt a little sorry for him too. George's parents had originally brought him to the hospital for help with his epilepsy, which is a disorder of the brain characterized by repeated seizures. At this time, people were just beginning to understand how epilepsy actually worked. George's parents most likely saw it as a mental condition, which is why they brought him to the state hospital. They probably didn't think he was crazy, they just wanted help with getting his seizures under control. But during George's initial evaluation, the staff psychologist would diagnose George with paranoid schizophrenia, and then they had George involuntarily committed for life. Mickey didn't understand how that was possible. He'd never seen George hallucinate or get aggressive like the other patients with schizophrenia, but there was nothing he could do about it. And if he was being honest with himself, he was glad to have someone so mild-mannered and easygoing to help him in the kitchen. Mickey yanked the lid off the canister that George had just set down, revealing hundreds of thawing egg yolks. These days, a lot of the hospital's food supply came from federal surplus deliveries, since the government was rationing food to help the war effort. The egg whites were used in food that was sent overseas, and hospitals stateside got the leftover yolks. It was time to start cooking, so Mickey dumped out the canister into the metal vat. He repeated the process 2 more times until the stovetop was crowded with thawing eggs. He handed George a cup and asked for water, and then he lit the stovetop so the eggs would warm faster. He let George dump the water into the vat, then the two of them started slicing bread loaves. Once they were done, Mickey turned on the oven and laid all the bread slices across the metal grates to be toasted. Then he turned his attention back to the eggs. They were finally thawed, so Mickey asked George to grab some powdered milk. It was the only thing that made the egg yolks creamy enough to scramble. As Mickey stirred the eggs, he sent George to fetch something else, postum powder, a caffeine-free coffee substitute they'd been getting from the government over the past year. Mickey even let George mix the drink himself. He'd never let a patient touch an actual dinner item before, so Mickey took a quick sip just to be safe. The postum tasted like chalk, which meant it was made correctly. He clapped George on the back and told him he'd done a great job. But that momentary taste test distracted Mickey just long enough for the eggs to start burning. Mickey cussed as he turned off the stovetop, wondering how to fix this. He threw in a palmful of salt and then gave the eggs a stir, and then they looked good as new. When dinner was finally done, Mickey and George portioned the eggs and toast into buffet dishes and then loaded them onto a big cart for delivery at each of the 5 dining halls spread across the hospital's wards. By the time they got to Ward 5, hungry patients lined the hallway outside the cafeteria, urging Mickey and George to please hurry up. Finally, a bell rang and the lines began to move. From behind the buffet table, Mickey watched as the patients ladled scrambled eggs onto their plates. He helped serve them each a piece of toast, and then sent the patients to sit at the long metal tables that ran the length of the dining hall. And as the patients all dug into their food, Mickey heard someone call out that the eggs were too salty. Mickey winced and felt bad because he knew he very well could have oversalted them. And while Mickey was worrying about the eggs, another patient in the room took a long swig of postum and then started to choke. One of the nurses walked over to pat the patient on the back, but instead of swallowing, the patient keeled over and threw up on the nurse's shoes. The nurse shrieked, and Mickey looked over and saw a red streak on the ground. It took him a second to realize that it wasn't vomit, it was blood. The patient then fell backwards onto the floor, and those around him began to scream. The nurse bent over and tried to steady the man, who was now having a seizure on the floor. Mickey ran over to help her, but before he could make it, another patient sent a spray of red blood shooting across the table. Mickey shouted for everyone to stop eating. But his warning came too late. More patients began throwing up blood. Others collapsed onto the floor, writhing in pain. Mickey didn't know what to do, so he just tried to catch patients as they fell. One nurse ran into the hallway and sounded an alarm. Mickey stooped over a patient who was clawing at his own face, saying he couldn't feel it. His lips were swollen and blue. He tried to help the man return to his seat, but the man collapsed back down to the floor and started saying that his legs were paralyzed. Mickey was totally horrified and his hands trembled with fear, and he had no idea what could cause this terrible reaction people were having. Dr. William Lidbeck had just finished dinner when his phone rang at his home on the hospital grounds. When he picked it up, all he heard on the other end was screaming and shouting. Then a panic-stricken nurse got on the line and begged him to run up to the hospital. Patients across 4 of the 5 wards were collapsing, they were vomiting blood, and now losing feeling in their faces and limbs. Dr. Lidbeck dropped his fork, ran out his front door, and tore across the lawn, heading for the side entrance of the main hospital building, 100 yards from his cottage. With every step, the screaming he could hear grew louder. It sounded like every patient inside of the building was in agony. Moments later, the doctor flung the door open and stepped into the hallway, and the scene that greeted him was horrible. The hallway was full of patients sitting on the floor with their backs up against the wall, coughing blood into their laps. One man had been strapped to a gurney in the hallway, spasming wildly, blood running down the front of his shirt. His entire mouth was swollen and drool collected at the side of his lips. A nurse ran into the hallway and beckoned Dr. Lidbeck to come quickly. He followed her through a doorway into the cafeteria, where he saw dozens of patients writhing on the floor. The nurse that Dr. Lidbeck had followed dashed ahead of him. She knelt down beside one of the patients and started spoon-feeding him baking soda. Dr. Lidbeck caught up to her and asked what was going on. She admitted that the nursing staff had no idea what had caused this outbreak, but it had started right after the patients had begun their dinner. She didn't know how to reverse it, but she was just hoping that baking soda would help alleviate their stomach pain. The entire staff was running around in complete panic, trying to manage symptoms. Dr. Lidbeck took a deep breath and tried to push down his rising fear. He'd never dealt with sudden illness on such a massive scale, but he knew that he couldn't do anything without the proper equipment. He had to get his medicine bag from his office on the second floor. He instructed the nurse to keep working, then ran out of the cafeteria and down the hallway. He turned the corner into the 3rd ward, where the scene was exactly the same. It was full of patients covered in their own blood, writhing on the floor. Dr. Lidbeck had always prided himself on having a steely stomach, but this felt unbearable to watch. He rushed through the hallway, stepping over sick patients as he went, and ran up the stairs to the 2nd floor. But as he left the stairwell, he stopped dead in his tracks. The atmosphere in this ward was completely different. The hallway was empty. If it weren't for the screams echoing from downstairs, it would almost feel peaceful. As he walked past open doors, he saw all the patients tucked in their beds. They looked scared, but seemed to be otherwise fine. Dr. Lidbeck was confused. How was this ward so calm when the rest were full of chaos and vomiting patients? A door opened at the end of the hallway, and the ward's head nurse, Allie Wassel, stepped out and walked toward him. Dr. Lidbeck thought she looked really pale. The nurse seemed very relieved to see Lidbeck, and she would tell him that she thought there had to be something wrong with the eggs from dinner. She said she had taken one bite and they had tasted so spoiled that she ordered all her patients not to eat them, and so her patients were fine, but she had been throwing up ever since. A chill ran through Dr. Lidbeck. He didn't know yet what was causing his patients to vomit blood, but now he knew it very likely had to be related to the eggs. It was the only thing all the patients had eaten that night. But it couldn't just be a case of spoiled food. An egg would have to be so rotten to cause this that it never would have been served in the first place. It would have been obviously bad. Then a realization dawned on him. If the eggs themselves were fine, it meant that something else had been put in the eggs that night. He was glad that Nurse Wassel had not eaten more of them. Dr. Lidbeck told the head nurse that if she started feeling worse, to please come find him right away, and then the doctor ran back downstairs to tend to the sick patients. As Dr. Lidbeck went down a hallway, he passed by the hospital morgue. A nurse was wheeling a covered stretcher inside. One of the patients had died. Dr. Lidbeck's blood ran cold, but he didn't have time to stop and mourn. There were hundreds of other patients still waiting for treatment, and so he didn't have a moment to lose. About 16 hours later, in the late morning of November 19th, Oregon Governor Charles Sprague raced along the highway in his car. An hour earlier, Sprague had heard about last night's outbreak at the state hospital. Now he was on the way to the state capitol, where an emergency state board of control meeting would soon commence. From the moment the United States had entered the war, Sprague feared a morning like this. He was worried that the outbreak at the hospital was caused by sabotage, that the country's enemies had deliberately tampered with these eggs. He knew that the Oregon State Hospital received food rations from the government. The frozen eggs had been part of a shipment to the hospital 6 months ago. But those eggs had been separated from a much larger batch. It was entirely possible that someone had poisoned that larger supply, which was then sent around to various institutions throughout the country. Sprague worried that if someone had tampered with the egg supply, anywhere that had received eggs from that batch would suffer a similar attack. Sprague shuddered at the thought of a spy for the Axis powers poisoning innocent Americans. The Food and Drug Administration had already ordered all institutions that received these eggs to immediately stop using them. Sprague's driver stopped the car outside the front steps of the Capitol building. Once Sprague got out, he was greeted by an aide who walked with him up the stairs. The aide had just received word from the hospital. As of 10:30 that morning, 47 patients had died, and their bodies were still lining the hospital hallways, and another 350 patients were violently ill. As governor, Sprague needed to make sure that investigators had the resources necessary to investigate the egg tampering and find out who was behind it. He told the aide that he'd be a few minutes late to the meeting, then headed for his office to call the chief of police in Salem, Oregon, where the state hospital was located. Later that afternoon, the superintendent of the hospital, Dr. John Evans, stood in front of a cage of rats in a laboratory. He was holding a plateful of scrambled eggs. Earlier that morning, a coroner had requested permission to perform autopsies on the patients who had died. Dr. Evans allowed him to take 6 of the dead, hoping the autopsy results could tell him what had happened. A few hours after the coroner had taken the bodies, Dr. Evans received a toxicology report that confirmed his worst fear. The patients had been poisoned. However, nobody knew yet what they were poisoned with or how. The coroner was still running tests. But that was why Dr. Evans was now holding a plateful of the contaminated scrambled eggs that had been served the night before. He was running his own experiment. On a neighboring table, there was another cage of rats and another plate of eggs. But these eggs came straight from one of the egg yolk canisters still in the freezer. A lab technician had thawed them out that morning. They reasoned that if only the first cage of rats died, that meant the poison had been added into the eggs at the hospital. But if both cages of rats died, it meant the eggs themselves had been poisoned before they were shipped to the hospital, and tens of thousands of people could be in danger. Dr. Evans placed each plate of eggs into their respective cages and then waited for the rats to eat. A moment later, the rats in the first cage began to shake violently and foam at the mouth. They squealed in pain, and within minutes, all of them were dead. Dr. Evans looked over at the other cage and saw those rats were just fine. The experiment had worked. It confirmed this wasn't a case of mass contamination or widespread enemy conspiracy. The eggs were clearly just fine when they arrived at the hospital before something or someone poisoned them. But it also meant there could be a mass murderer inside the hospital who was the one who added the poison. Enraged and disgusted, Dr. Evans called the police. 3 days later, on November 22nd, head nurse Allie Wassel, who had ordered her patients not to eat the eggs, sat in Dr. Lidbeck's office speaking to a barrel-chested detective. The investigators had been interviewing every patient and member of staff for the past 2 days, trying to determine who poisoned the eggs. Further testing had revealed that the poison was sodium fluoride, better known as cockroach poison. Detectives had even found some in a basement storeroom. But what they didn't know was how it had gotten into the eggs or who had done it. Allie wanted to help, but she told the detective that she hadn't seen anything suspicious. Until that horrible dinner, she'd been on duty, taking care of patients. She watched the detective as he scribbled something down on a notepad, and she started to feel nervous. Allie assured the detective that the other nurses would confirm her story, too. The detective wrote a few more things down and then looked up at Allie and thanked her for her time and told her she was free to go. Allie breathed a sigh of relief and stood up to leave. As she reached the door, the detective told an officer standing outside to bring in the next person to be interviewed, assistant cook Mickey McKillop. Allie passed Mickey as she was walking down the hallway. He was waiting in a chair outside the office, bouncing his leg up and down. Allie couldn't help but think that he looked anxious, or like a man who was hiding something. By late that same evening, Mickey McKillop had been in Dr. Lidbeck's office for hours. The detective had asked him the same few questions over and over, pressing him about the way the kitchens were run. Mickey thought he'd kept his story straight, but he'd told it so many times now that it was hard to be sure, and he knew he was likely starting to confuse the details. All Mickey wanted to do was sleep. He had a migraine that was making it hard to focus, but every time he closed his eyes, the detective would shake him awake. And so Mickey was feeling like he would do just about anything to make this interview end. It was obvious the police were suspicious of him, and Mickey knew they would not give up until he, Mickey, told the police what they needed to know. So Mickey decided it was time to come clean. Mickey sat up in the stiff wooden chair, and while avoiding eye contact with the detective, Mickey would admit that he did know more than he had told them. Mickey said that he could tell them exactly who had poisoned the eggs. In fact, he had watched it happen, and worst of all, he had not done a thing to stop it. An hour later, Mickey and his boss, Mary O'Hare, were being led from the Oregon State Hospital in handcuffs. A police officer read the charges. Mickey was charged with manslaughter, Mary was charged with accessory after the fact. Then the officer loaded them into a police van. Mickey took one last look at the hospital and caught a glimpse of a few patients staring out the windows, terrified looks on their faces. One of the faces he recognized was George Nosen, the psychiatric patient who volunteered in the kitchen. Mickey shook his head. He knew that what he had just told the detectives would change George's life forever. When Mickey the cook finally told the truth to detectives, he began by telling them about the terrible evening the sickness broke out. While the nursing staff was running around treating all these patients who were vomiting up blood, Mickey saw George Nosen cowering in the hallway, and suddenly Mickey had a terrible thought. He grabbed George and asked him to retrace his steps from that afternoon. Mickey and George mimed preparing the eggs, getting the frozen yolks, lighting the stove, getting some water to help warm them. Then Mickey followed George down the kitchen steps in search of the powdered milk that made the eggs creamy. At the bottom of the steps, there were 2 storeroom doors. Instinctively, Mickey leaned toward the storeroom on the left, which held dry goods, but George led him to the storeroom on the right, which held fruits and vegetables. Mickey felt an icy chill run through him. He watched George turn the key and open the right door. George pointed to a large, unmarked tin canister sitting on the ground inside. It was open and filled with white powder. A scoop was sticking out of the powder like it had just been used. Mickey's stomach dropped, but he tried to look unbothered. He thanked George and sent him to his room. Then he ran back upstairs and grabbed his boss, Mary, and showed her the canister George had just pointed out. Mary went white as a sheet. It was against the rules for Mickey to have given keys to a patient. Mary told Mickey that she did understand why he'd done it. They were so understaffed, he'd been desperate for help. But if anyone found out, they were both done for, and so they agreed to keep it a secret. Mary had kept her promise and said nothing, but Mickey eventually broke and told the story to the detective in Dr. Lidbeck's office. Once the detective got Mickey's confession, they knew who had poisoned the eggs at the Oregon State Hospital and how they had done it. That fateful night, George had taken the keys to the storeroom and headed down to the basement. But he went into the wrong storeroom. He went into the right door, and he brought back a heaping scoop of white powder that he believed was powdered milk, but it wasn't. He then poured that white powder into a vat of scrambled eggs, and in doing so, George had accidentally poisoned his fellow patients with sodium fluoride, aka cockroach poison. To this day, nobody knows why the poison was kept in that storeroom with the fruits and vegetables. In adults, a lethal dosage of sodium fluoride is just 5 to 10 grams, which is a bit more than what you'd find in a sugar packet. Well, George had accidentally spiked the eggs with 5 pounds of poison. In the end, the charges against Mickey the cook and his boss Mary were dismissed. The hospital was held liable since the real culprit was gross understaffing. The only person who suffered any real consequences for the mistake was George, who was unable to leave Oregon State Hospital for another 41 years. George was never the same after that night. He couldn't forgive himself for what he'd done, even if it was just a tragic mistake. The patients who remembered the outbreak bullied him relentlessly for decades. And after a while, George started fighting back. He got into physical brawls on multiple occasions. And then, in 1983, he got into a big altercation with an older inmate, and during it, George was severely injured and died as a result. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lan. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Andrew Rosenblum. For Ballin Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomanang. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Senior producers are Laura Donna Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.
Hey, it's Mr. Ballin here. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series. Whether you're new to Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body.
In November of 2007, a scientist stood on the edge of a 50-foot wide crater in the Peruvian high desert. The crater was full of water. But despite its innocent-looking appearance, this crater full of water held incredible danger. When it formed 2 months earlier, hundreds of people and animals in the area had gotten violently sick, and so far, no one had come up with a good explanation for how this was possible. In fact, according to the laws of physics, the crater shouldn't even exist. It was a mystery that had researchers all over the planet scratching their heads. But as the scientist stared down into the big crater, he thought he might have the answer to both of these mysteries. And if he was right, it would mean that the threat posed by this crater was far greater than anyone imagined. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries.
where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please ask the follow button to come skip some stones with you on a lake, but when the follow button isn't looking, steal their phone and skip that into the water. Today's story is called The Carancas Curse. It was a chilly morning on September 15th, 2007. A sheep farmer named Gregorio Yaruri sat on his porch, sipping a mug of coffee and looking at the distant mountain peaks that surrounded his hometown of Carancas, a small village in southern Peru. It was silent except for the sheep bleating in the pasture. Then Gregorio heard a low sound, like a hum. At first, the noise was faint, and it sounded like it was coming from miles away. Then the hum grew louder, and the coffee in his mug started to vibrate. A moment later, pebbles on the ground surrounding his porch began to shake as the hum turned into a roar. Alarmed, Gregorio set down his mug and leaped down into the yard. He looked around, trying to figure out if the noise was human-made, or maybe an earthquake. He covered his ears as the hum roared to a deafening scream. Then he spotted something small and orange streaking through the sky. An instant later, a sonic boom whipped across the valley, shattering a window in Gregorio's house. He was thrown onto his back and he rolled a few times before steadying himself in the dirt. Noises began to erupt all across the plain. Gregorio could hear dogs howling and shouts coming from some of the neighboring farms. Gregorio was bracing himself for something else to happen, but the sky above him was bright blue again. So he stood up, feeling totally shell-shocked, as he brushed the dust from his pants. He scanned the horizon for some clue as to what had caused this explosion. In the distance, he could see a plume of thick black smoke rising 100 feet into the air. At first, Gregorio was filled with dread. Then, a sense of determination swelled up inside of him. He needed to know what had just fallen from the sky. He ran for the bicycle he kept leaning up against the side of his house. He brushed the glass shards from his broken window off the seat, and then he hopped on and he set his feet on the pedals and took off towards the tower of smoke. As Gregorio neared the site of impact, the smell of rotten eggs stung the inside of his nostrils. He pulled over just long enough to grab his bandana out of his back pocket and tie it around his face to block the smell. About 100 feet from the tower of smoke, he noticed red dust covering the ground. The closer he got, the thicker the blanket of dust seemed to be. When he finally reached the base of the smoke plume, he rubbed the dust with his feet. It appeared to be clay that had been kicked up by the crash. The smoke was so thick, he still couldn't tell what had impacted the ground. But whatever it was, it had created what appeared to be a huge crater in the ground. The column of smoke was emerging from a hole about 50 feet across. It really looked like someone had just detonated a bomb there. A few minutes later, the smoke started thinning out, and Gregorio could finally see into this crater. He walked up to the edge, and his eyes widened from a combination of fear and wonder. The crater was filled with a dark green liquid. The liquid had a consistency somewhere between maybe water and sludge, and it was bubbling as if it was simmering. Gregorio pinched his nose through the bandana. The egg smell coming off of this crater was so strong that he felt sick to his stomach. He walked around the perimeter of the crater, kicking at the shards of clay and jagged rock that littered the ground. It looked like someone had smashed a huge vase to pieces. Gregorio scanned the horizon. It seemed like he was the only person who'd come to investigate this plume of smoke. He figured the neighboring farmers must be worried that whatever crashed into the ground was a bad omen. A lot of his neighbors still believed in ancient spirits. But after a while, it struck Gregorio as kind of odd that not even an emergency vehicle had come out to survey the scene. Something had just shot out of the sky and smashed into the earth. It felt like that was the kind of thing police would want to know about. But Gregorio knew help would not be coming from his village. Only about 250 people lived in Caracas, so it didn't have its own police force. The authorities were located in the nearby town of Desaguadero, which was about 7 miles up the road. Gregorio wasn't sure if the folks in Desaguadero would be able to see the smoke plume from there. If they couldn't, he worried that the authorities might not even know this happened. Gregorio jumped back on his bicycle and pedaled to the house of a neighbor who owned a motorcycle that Gregorio knew he'd be able to borrow. It was going to be up to him to raise the alarm, and he had to get out there fast. About 20 minutes later, Gregorio parked his borrowed motorcycle in front of the police station in Desaguadero and then walked inside. He was greeted by a tired-looking receptionist with the phone pressed to her ear. It seemed like she'd been talking to people for hours. 3 deputies were talking loudly about an airstrike. It took a minute for Gregorio to realize what was going on. The police did know about this explosion. One of them had seen the orange streak in the sky, but they thought that Caracas had actually been struck by a missile. Gregorio waved down one of the officers and explained he had seen a crater filled with this green ooze that smelled terrible. The officer disappeared into a back room for a moment, and then he returned with the chief of police. They asked if Gregorio could lead them to the crash site. Gregorio agreed. Soon, he was back on his neighbor's motorcycle, leading police cars along the 7-mile road back to the Caracas countryside. As the crash site came into view, Gregorio could see people moving around the rim of the crater. As he drew even closer, he realized that dozens of villagers from Caracas had come to see what had caused the smoke. He guessed that when the black plume of smoke had dissipated, the neighbors figured it was now safe to come take a look. Gregorio pulled over his motorcycle about 20 yards from the crater and dismounted. The police cars fanned out around him. As policemen approached the perimeter of the crater, Gregorio noticed his neighbors picking up rock fragments as souvenirs and pointing at the green liquid at the bottom of the massive hole. Gregorio overheard a nearby couple speculate that maybe this was the result of a missile strike from Peru's neighbor and rival, Chile. One teenage boy was talking excitedly, telling his friends they were probably just attacked by a UFO. An old woman, who Gregorio assumed was the boy's grandmother, told him to be quiet. This was clearly a sign of bad things to come, a curse sent by the spirits. She sounded terrified. Gregorio did not find any of these theories very convincing. However, he wasn't ready to offer any of his own. But the strange explosion had him just as curious as his neighbors. He picked up a shard of deep red rock near his feet and slipped it into his coat pocket, just as another car pulled onto the scene. Gregorio recognized the mayor of Caracas, Maximiliano Trujillo. Mayor Trujillo stepped out of the back seat, squinting in the sunlight. The mayor walked toward the crater, looking stunned. He stopped right next to Gregorio and asked what happened. Gregorio just shrugged, still in disbelief. Straight ahead of them, a pile of black rocks were smoking at the edge of the crater. The mayor's eyes widened when he saw them, and he began walking toward the crater to get a better look. By late afternoon, hundreds of people had gathered at the crash site. Gregorio stood near the front of the crowd, hoping that if he stuck around long enough, the police might announce what had caused this explosion. As the sun started to set, the smell of rotten eggs returned. It was faint, but pungent. Gregorio's eyes began to water. He pulled his bandana back up over his face, but that didn't work anymore. The smell was giving him a headache. A few minutes later, a short woman standing near Gregorio leaned over and began vomiting, and she wasn't the only one. People all around the crater were starting to get sick. Between the rotten smell coming off the green sludge and now the vomit, the air around the crater was now so thick that Gregorio thought he might faint. He fought his way through the crowd back to his motorcycle and sped off towards home, sucking in the fresh air as he went. When he walked through his front door, his phone was ringing. It was his son, who had moved about 6 hours away for a job after he had graduated school. As Gregorio told him about the afternoon's excitement, he took the rock out of his pocket and he laid it on the kitchen table. He began to describe its deep red color, but his son cut him off. He begged Gregorio not to touch it. If Caracas was attacked by a missile, then this red rock could very likely be radioactive. Gregorio remembered the people getting sick at the crater. He felt a surge of anxiety, and he covered the rock with a dish towel. If his son was right, half the town was now vulnerable, and Gregorio spent more time at the crater than anyone else. Panicked, he hung up on his son and ran outside to hose himself off. He didn't know how much it would help, but he had to do something. He spent the rest of the evening feeling totally anxious, until finally he managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Gregorio woke up with the sun as usual. He still felt a bit queasy, but no worse than the night before. He breathed a big sigh of relief, because he figured that radiation poisoning would have made him feel a lot sicker by now, and so probably he was in the clear. As the sunrise turned the sky a vivid pink, Gregorio walked out of his house towards the sheep pen. He grabbed tufts of hay and dried grass and scattered them on the ground, and the sheep came running over to graze. Gregorio watched until one of the sheep picked its head up and ambled away. Then he noticed something unusual. There were dark splotches on the hay right where the sheep's head had been. It took Gregorio a moment to realize what he was looking at. He walked over and grabbed the sheep that had ambled off, and he lifted its head up, and blood was trickling out of its nose. Then he looked at the ground. Another splotch of blood stained the hay beneath his feet. As he walked the length of the pen, he found drops of blood spattered all over the ground. Gregorio rushed inside and called his vet, expecting to leave a voicemail since it was still early, but to his surprise, the vet actually picked up. He sounded wide awake, like he'd already been up for hours. He said that he'd been getting calls all morning. Livestock across Caracas were getting sick. The vet promised to make Gregorio's farm his next stop. Gregorio thanked him and hung up. He had no idea what kind of sickness had emerged from that crater, but it seemed like it could be deadly. A few days after the crash, Mayor Trujillo walked between rooms at a health clinic. Every exam table had been turned into a makeshift hospital bed. More than 200 people who visited the crash site had flooded the hospital in Desaguadero. They were all sick with migraine headaches, and they were vomiting. The hospital got so overwhelmed with patients, they diverted people to smaller health clinics throughout the city, which were now acting as satellite operations. Mayor Trujillo had called the Red Cross to help administer care in these satellite clinics, but now even the clinics were completely full. The smell inside the packed clinic was terrible. People were retching and crying. To the mayor, it felt like he was walking through a war zone. Thankfully, he'd received confirmation that morning from the authorities in Lima, the capital of Peru, that Caracas had not been attacked by a missile. In fact, scientists said that the crater had been caused by a meteorite. Mayor Trujillo was relieved that they were not under attack, but a mystery remained. Nobody knew why people were now getting sick. Meteorites had never been known to have that kind of effect. Specialists were flying out from Lima to investigate further. Mayor Trujillo moved through the crowd of patients in the waiting room, trying his best to reassure them. He stopped by a Red Cross doctor who was tending to a small elderly woman on a folding chair. The mayor greeted the old woman and then thanked the doctor for traveling all this way to Desaguadero. The doctor stood upright, looking tired but hopeful. He explained that all the patients' blood work was coming back normal. He didn't know why they were sick, but judging from their symptoms, he said everyone should make a full recovery in a few days. Trujillo smiled with relief, but the old woman hissed and called the doctor a liar. Many of the patients around her nodded in agreement, eyeing the doctor like he was in on some big conspiracy. He heard them muttering about evil spirits causing this disaster. Trujillo knew that many villagers believed the meteorite was a curse from the ancient spirits, and because of that, many had refused to listen to the Red Cross doctors and aid workers. To Trujillo, this was the problem with people of the Caracas region. Outsiders never came to the area, so many of the villagers didn't trust them. Trujillo knew that Caracas was not cursed. He just needed to find a way to get his people to listen. Then an idea struck. Maybe he could get them to believe the science with the help of someone who could appease the spirits. Trujillo left the health clinic, climbed into his car, and drove the 7 miles to Caracas. The small village, nestled in the shadows of snow-capped mountains, was eerily quiet and deserted. As the mayor slowly drove through the narrow and winding streets, he could see people peering out their windows. Normally, they'd come outside to wave hello, but now it seemed like they were terrified of leaving their homes. A few minutes later, Trujillo pulled up to a small adobe house with a thatched roof. It belonged to the local shaman, a man the mayor had long respected for his wisdom. Everybody in town trusted the shaman, and Trujillo hoped he could bring some calm to the community. Trujillo stepped out of his car, and he was pleased to see that the shaman came out of his house to greet him. Trujillo explained the situation to the shaman, and the shaman nodded thoughtfully, and he agreed that the meteorite was not a curse, although it had disrupted balance in the land. And so he said he was happy to do his part to restore the natural order of things. Trujillo smiled and shook the shaman's hand. He promised he'd be in touch soon, and then Mayor Trujillo headed back to his car. With the shaman's help, he was sure he could get the townspeople to listen to him and restore order in the town. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Montreal, Canada, a professor named Peter Schultz was standing in line at a coffee shop scrolling through the news app on his phone. He taught Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University in Rhode Island, but he was in Montreal for a conference on craters made by meteorites and other space objects. He was fascinated by the articles about the meteorite strike in southern Peru, and not just because he found meteorites in general interesting. This one stuck out because it made no sense. The reports said that Caracas was struck by a chondrite meteorite, the most common type of meteorite, but also the most fragile. A chondrite meteorite is a type of rock that comes from asteroids. They're made up of small grains of minerals that have not been melted or changed much since they formed billions of years ago. Chondrites are so porous that they crack and burn up in Earth's atmosphere before they can hit the ground. To Peter, it seemed impossible that one of these chondrite meteorites could hit the Earth with enough force to create this massive crater. Stranger still, he had read that more than 200 people who visited the crash site had ended up in the hospital. Meteorites should not be making people sick. Peter thought there had to be more to the story than met the eye. Peter turned his phone to silent and spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back lectures at his conference. He finally left around dusk. As he walked to dinner, he noticed his voicemail was full of inquiries from different reporters and news outlets, hoping for a comment from him on how a meteorite could cause such a widespread sickness. But Peter had to tell these reporters the truth. He did not have answers, but he wanted to get them, and the only way to do it was to head to Peru and see the crater for himself. A few days later, Mayor Trujillo stood in the very crowded community center in Desaguadero. He had needed a huge space to hold this town hall meeting, and Caracas didn't really have a building that could accommodate this size crowd. Even this community center was packed with almost every single person from Caracas in attendance. The mayor shivered, but not because he was cold. He knew that the government scientists had discovered something that would have a profound impact on everyone in this area, and not just for those who had gotten sick at the crater. As Trujillo stood there waiting, he spotted Gregorio Yaruri sitting in the back. He was grateful to him for his role in alerting the authorities, and was happy to see that Gregorio looked healthy. In fact, most of the locals who'd gotten sick were starting to feel better. But Trujillo knew if they didn't listen to the scientists, then things could get worse again. Trujillo had invited 2 guests to this meeting. One was the local shaman, and the other was a geologist named Luisa Macedo. She was one of the scientists flown in by the government. The mayor made his way to the front of the crowd and called for silence. He had to choose his words carefully to avoid panicking those who believed that Caracas was actually cursed. He cleared his throat and announced that, yes, something had fallen from the sky, but it had been a meteorite from outer space. Before anyone could argue with him, he called the shaman over to join him and asked if he could prepare a sacrifice. It needed to be something that would appease the spirits in case they were the ones who sent the meteorite crashing to Earth. The shaman nodded. He told the crowd that they had rightfully sensed that the meteorite had unbalanced the land, but he reassured them that the correct sacrifice would help appease any unhappy spirits. He promised he would sacrifice a llama fetus at the crater as soon as possible, which should be enough to restore harmony to the area. Several of the older women present smiled, but Mayor Trujillo was still tense. Now came the hard part, getting them to accept the scientists' findings without panicking. He introduced Luisa, the government geologist. The hall erupted in whispers. Trujillo told the villagers to calm down, that Luisa was from southern Peru just like they were. That's why he'd asked her to speak. Everyone seemed to accept this, since a regional scientist seemed a little more trustworthy. The crowd settled down a bit, and then Luisa smiled and she held up a large cardboard chart she'd made showing data on the local water table. Trujillo held his breath, worried she was making things more complicated. Instead, the crowd pushed in to get a better look at what she had. Luisa explained that she and her team weren't totally sure what was making so many people and livestock sick, but they had a strong theory. The day that she and her team had arrived in town, they'd gone to the crash site and collected samples from different parts of the area. They also tested the groundwater at the bottom of the crater. Mayor Trujillo saw Luisa hesitate for a moment and then continue. She said that her team found that the water contained dangerous levels of arsenic, a deadly poison. The crowd erupted in murmurs of alarm. As Trujillo looked around the room, he wasn't surprised by everyone's reaction. When he first heard Luisa's theory, he'd been stunned too, but he needed the crowd to listen. Their lives depended on what Luisa had to say. Trujillo raised his hands and called for order, and after a few seconds, the townspeople did quiet down, and he told them to continue to listen to Luisa. Luisa nodded and then explained that when the meteorite hit Caracas, the shockwave caused the groundwater to heat up and vaporize. This caused the air to fill with a fine mist of arsenic vapor. Everyone who had gone to see the crater got sick because they had inhaled that vapor. After hearing what she had to say, the crowd became agitated again and started shouting questions. Mayor Trujillo saw Gregorio in the back, trying to be heard, and so Trujillo demanded everyone be quiet, and he pointed at Gregorio and asked him to speak. Gregorio, the sheep farmer, stood up and politely asked Luisa if that meant their drinking water was contaminated too. Luisa stayed silent for a moment. Trujillo could tell she was carefully thinking about what to say next. Finally, she nodded and said that although they did need to do more testing, it was very likely. In fact, most likely, their water supply had been contaminated for years, making the people less healthy and more vulnerable to deadly diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And so until they knew for sure, Luisa advised the crowd to just drink bottled water. Gregorio was alarmed by what he heard, but he thanked her and sat down. Everyone else seemed totally stunned into silence by Luisa's explanation. First the meteor hit, making people sick. Now they learned their water was contaminated all along. Trujillo knew it was frightening, but at least they knew what they were dealing with. After answering more questions, Luisa wrapped up her remarks and walked off the stage. But as she headed toward him, Mayor Trujillo noticed that the scientist looked anxious. He pulled her aside and asked if everything was okay. Luisa shook her head and told him that something still didn't make sense. She was confident that the sickness had been caused by arsenic gas from the meteorite impact, but she had not actually proven that. No scientists had detected arsenic in the air around the crater. That was a theory. In fact, she didn't understand how the meteorite could have gotten hot enough to create this toxic arsenic vapor. Luisa explained that meteorites are usually freezing when they impact Earth, even though they may look like they're on fire. That's because space is extremely cold, with an average temperature of negative 454 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction caused by entering Earth's atmosphere would have heated it up a little bit, but not enough to boil water and turn it into a mist. Mayor Trujillo frowned. He now realized that even Luisa wasn't sure that her arsenic theory was right. And if she was wrong, then something else had made his people sick. Trujillo was troubled. But he had a more immediate challenge, making sure the local drinking water was safe. It was up to the scientists to figure out whether arsenic vapor or something else had caused the mass sickness. Until they figured it out, Trujillo knew he would not sleep well. A little over 2 months later, in December of 2007, Professor Peter Schultz arrived in Caracas to investigate the crash site. On a dry and sunny day, he drove through the winding roads of the rugged countryside until he reached the crater. Even though the rainy season had nearly filled it with water, he was struck by how massive it was. Peter had heard about Luisa Macedo's discovery of arsenic in the water. There was no debate that there was arsenic in the water itself, but so far, nobody had been able to explain how, or even if, arsenic got into the air. Until that was proven, there was still the possibility that some other chemical from the meteorite's impact had made everyone sick. If that was the case, the people of Caracas could still be in danger. Peter was determined to find the answer and make sure these people were safe. And over the next few weeks, he was able to slowly form a theory that connected all the dots. Usually, when chondrite meteorites shoot through the Earth's atmosphere, their fragile makeup causes them to shatter into hundreds of tiny pieces, which turn to ash long before they ever reach the Earth's surface. And that's what should have happened with this meteorite. Peter concluded that the Caracas meteorite survived its passage through the atmosphere because of its high speed and shallow entry angle. He believed that these factors, along with the heat from the Earth's atmosphere, caused the outer layers of the meteorite to melt and fuse back together. That made it dense enough to make it through the atmosphere, where it became superheated and unleashed the arsenic vapor once it hit the ground. All this meant that the people of Caracas were safe. It was the meteorite and not some other unidentified danger that heated up the arsenic-laced water and turned it into vapor. Thankfully, the damage caused by the meteorite's impact was not permanent. All the people who'd gotten sick, including Gregorio Yaruri, made a full recovery, and so did all the animals. Thanks to the research of Luisa Macedo and the other scientists, arsenic was detected in the drinking water, and nonprofit organizations have installed measures to make it safer. Even though the water is cleaner and the arsenic gas is long gone, the people of Caracas will always remember when, in a way, they were attacked by a UFO. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Land. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chilelli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.
Hey, it's Mr. Ballin here. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series.
Whether you're new to Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body.
In the early spring of 1892, an older woman in a tiny Rhode Island town shuffled into her kitchen at 1 a.m. to make a late-night cup of tea. And as she passed by her front window, she saw a man riding on horseback down the dirt road outside holding up a flickering lantern. She recognized this man. He was the only doctor in town, and she could tell he was headed towards a large farm at the end of the road. And the woman had heard rumors that the farmer's son was deathly ill. She knew a house call in the middle of the night was not a good sign, but she also knew the doctor could not save the farmer's son. However, she could. So she threw on her coat, lit her own lantern, and set off into the night. From Ballen Studios in Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. And for this week's special Halloween episode, we're exploring something even more terrifying, the supernatural. For centuries, people believed that monsters, demons, and other horrors could cause deadly diseases and all kinds of misery. Nowadays, we tend to reject those explanations as ignorance and superstition, but for one New England farming family in the 1800s, that distinction wasn't so clear. Were they being plagued by a mysterious disease, or were they actually being preyed on by a creature thought only to exist in legend? So, if you like today's story, tell the follow button that you want to play the Floor is Lava game with them, but be sure to hide thumbtacks all over the room before you start playing. This episode is called She Haunts Me. On a spring morning in 1889, a 29-year-old doctor named Harold Metcalf was sitting in his parlor in the tiny town of Exeter, Rhode Island, when he heard his telegraph machine start clicking. He got up, walked over to the large metal machine, and watched it slowly print text onto a long, thin piece of paper. When it finished printing, Dr. Metcalf tore off the paper and read the telegram. It was a message from one of his neighbors, a farmer named George Brown. George said in this telegram that his only son, 22-year-old Edwin, had fallen ill, and he desperately needed Dr. Metcalf's help. The doctor let out a long sigh. He knew the Browns well. They'd once been a happy family of 9, with George, his wife, their 6 daughters, and their son, but Dr. Metcalf was all too aware of the tragedy that had struck the family over the past few years. 7 years ago, George's wife had come down with a mysterious disease that some locals called the White Death. It caused horrible symptoms like chronic fevers, extreme weight loss, and uncontrollable coughing. People with the disease grew pale and weak, and they got so emaciated that they looked like skeletons. It was like the disease literally drained the life out of them. Now, there were a lot of supposed treatments for the White Death, things like riding on horseback every day or drinking brown sugar mixed with water, but Dr. Metcalf knew these remedies did not work. In fact, he knew there was just no proven way to cure the White Death. Now, Dr. Metcalf had tried to help George's wife 7 years earlier by prescribing healthy food and exercise, but she still just kept on getting sicker. And in fact, she would die a year later, and then almost immediately afterwards, one of George's daughters also began showing symptoms of the dreaded disease. And again, Dr. Metcalf tried to help, but there was nothing he could do, and she also died within just a few months. Even though Dr. Metcalf knew the White Death was basically incurable, he still felt guilty for not being able to help George and his loved ones. And now, after reading George's telegram, Dr. Metcalf feared that Edwin might be the latest member of the Brown family to contract the deadly disease. But there was only one way to find out. Dr. Metcalf quickly packed his medical bag, threw a saddle on his horse, and raced off towards the Browns' farm. 15 minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trotted his horse along a thin country road in Exeter. To his right, he saw a vast field overgrown with weeds, with a crumbling country house right in the center. It was once a prosperous farm, but was now abandoned. The sight made Dr. Metcalf sad. He'd lived in Exeter his whole life, and he'd watched the quaint farming community turn into sort of a ghost town.
The Civil War and the White Death had decimated the community, leaving only a third of the population alive. In fact, these days, the town was more commonly known by its nickname, Deserted Exeter. After riding for a few more minutes, Dr. Metcalf reached a modest house on 40 acres of farmland. He knocked on the door, and right away, George Brown answered. He looked haggard, and he quickly led Dr. Metcalf to Edwin's bedroom. Inside the room, the doctor saw Edwin's wife and 5 remaining sisters crowded around a big 4-poster bed. Edwin was lying on the mattress in plain sight, but Dr. Metcalf barely could recognize him. The once husky farmhand had become bony and pale. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes were glassy, and when he tried to speak, he fell into a violent coughing fit. It was obvious to everyone, including the doctor, that Edwin had been gripped by the White Death. As Edwin tried to catch his breath, his father, George, approached the side of the bed and looked at the doctor and asked if there was anything he could do. Dr. Metcalf began rattling off his regular treatment plan, healthy food and exercise, but George stopped him. He said they'd already tried those things with his wife and his daughter and they hadn't worked. There had to be something different they could try. Dr. Metcalf hesitated, but then he said, yeah, there was another option. But he told them it was an experimental treatment, and so he couldn't guarantee it would work. George said he didn't care. At this point, he was willing to try anything to help Edwin. So Dr. Metcalf explained that some physicians believed that the White Death was caused, or at least was made worse, by living in humid climates, like Rhode Island. So it might help if Edwin moved out of Rhode Island and went somewhere with completely different weather. The doctor suggested Colorado Springs, Colorado, because it was a mountain town with very dry air and high elevations, and so it would be a drastic change from Rhode Island. But there was one really obvious problem. To get to Colorado, Edwin would have to travel 2,000 miles, and this would mean days and days of riding trains and horses, all while Edwin was severely ill, like it wasn't clear if he would live through the journey. Plus, his whole family couldn't just go with him, it would basically be Edwin and maybe his wife. And so after explaining this experimental protocol, Dr. Metcalf went quiet and just watched the Browns as they considered what he had just said. And it was obvious the entire family was very upset and didn't know what to make of this, but at the same time, they knew they had no other choice. And so as the sisters kind of held back tears and whispered amongst each other, and as George looked up at the doctor not sure what to say, finally Edwin, from the bed, croaked out the first words he'd said that day. He said that yes, he and his wife would go to Colorado. Three years later, in January of 1892, Edwin held his wife's hand as they walked through the snow in the Rocky Mountains. The high elevation and dry air in Colorado Springs had worked like a charm. Edwin was back to feeling like his normal self again. After walking a bit longer, Edwin told his wife they should head back home for lunch. When they got to their house, Edwin's wife rushed inside out of the cold, but Edwin stayed for a second and checked the mailbox for any letters from his dad and sisters. And he found there was an envelope, so he opened it and he unfolded the note inside. It was a handwritten letter from his father, and as Edwin scanned the paper, his face fell. The note said that one of Edwin's little sisters, 19-year-old Mercy, had unfortunately passed away. Edwin knew that Mercy had been sick. She'd contracted the White Death almost a year earlier. He had tried to convince her to move out to Colorado with him and his wife because he knew that would cure this, but Mercy said she didn't think she could make the long journey, and she didn't want to leave behind her sisters, and so she had stayed. But now, Mercy was gone, and so Edwin knew he would need to head back to Rhode Island and be there to grieve with his family. A few weeks later, back in Rhode Island, Edwin and his father braced themselves against the harsh winter cold in Exeter, and together, they silently dug rocks out of the frozen ground. They were trying to prepare the field for planting in the spring. It was hard work, but the physical labor was actually a welcome distraction from their grief. Edwin pushed a sharp shovel into the ground, and as he wedged another rock out of the soil, he suddenly felt like a heavy weight was pressing down on his chest. He dropped his shovel and started coughing so hard that it stung his throat. He put a hand over his mouth to block the cough, and when he caught his breath and moved his hand away, he saw that his palm was now speckled with blood. When he looked up, Edwin saw his father staring at him with a horrified expression. They both knew what this meant. Now that he was back in Rhode Island, Edwin's case of the White Death had returned. In March, about a month later, George woke in the night to the sound of his only son coughing violently. George jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen to grab a cup of water, and then made his way into Edwin's room, which was dimly lit by an oil lamp. Edwin had become so sick after contracting the White Death that he couldn't go anywhere, and he had been bedridden for the last 2 weeks here in Rhode Island. It was like all the progress he'd made living in Colorado had now been undone, and he was now sicker than he'd been before. He looked frail and gray, and George could see spots on the white bedsheet from where Edwin had been coughing up blood. George held out the cup of water for his son, and Edwin grabbed the glass with shaky hands and drank it in between coughs. Then Edwin looked at his father, and in a hoarse and frightened voice, he said something that terrified George. He said, "She was here. She haunts me." George just stared at his son. He had no idea what his son was talking about, but before George could ask, Edwin was gripped by another coughing fit, and the only thing George could think to do was send for Dr. Metcalf. Less than an hour later, George stood by Edwin's bedside as Dr. Metcalf examined his son. Now, George knew his son was in very bad shape at this point, but he was still shocked when Dr. Metcalf, after examining Edwin, turned to George and just said, "It's in God's hands now." There was apparently nothing he or anyone else could do to help Edwin. George was beyond devastated. He had lost his wife, 2 daughters, and now he was just counting the days until his only son passed away too. He felt totally powerless. But Edwin, despite hearing this grave news, was putting on a brave face. With his voice still hoarse from coughing, he asked his father if he had any whiskey. If his days were indeed numbered, well, they might as well enjoy the last few moments. George nodded and headed to the kitchen, and as he was taking glasses out of the cabinet for the whiskey, he heard a knock at the door, which was odd because it was well past midnight and he never had visitors this late. George set the glasses down, made his way to the door, and opened it up to see 6 of his neighbors standing there on the porch. One of them, an older woman with graying hair, said they'd heard that his son Edwin was sick, and a few of them had seen Dr. Metcalf come over earlier, and so they were concerned. But they said they were not just here to pay their condolences. They were here to try to save him. George had to stop himself from letting out a very bitter laugh. He already knew no one could help his son. No one had been able to help anybody else in his family when they had the White Death, and it was just a matter of time before his son died. But he let the neighbors inside anyway, if only because seeing a few familiar faces might lift his son's spirits. When George and the visitors rounded the corner into Edwin's room, most of the neighbors went to Edwin's bedside to say hello, but the older woman walked directly towards Dr. Metcalf and began speaking to him in a very hushed voice. George was curious, so he walked closer to listen, and he heard this woman tell Dr. Metcalf that she actually knew how to cure Edwin. The doctor told her that was not possible. Nobody could cure this sickness. But the woman said Edwin was not sick. He was actually cursed by a vampire. George watched Dr. Metcalf's face go red with anger. He told the woman that she was being absolutely ridiculous. The doctor then looked over at George like he wanted somebody to back him up here, but George was desperate enough to consider anything at this point, and as crazy as a vampire's curse sounded, he didn't think it was that far-fetched, and so he wanted to hear more from this woman. After all, the White Death had made his loved ones look like the life was being sucked out of them, almost like a vampire was draining their blood. And just earlier that night, Edwin had said something to George that totally caught him off guard when he said, "She was here. She haunts me." And so George wondered if maybe his son was referencing this vampire. And so George turned from the doctor to his son and asked him about what he had said earlier about somebody being in the room with him, somebody haunting him. And Edwin croaked out that earlier, when he was alone in the room, he had seen this woman standing in the corner of his bedroom, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. Now, he said he didn't know if this had been a dream or not, but it had felt so real that now he was scared to death from the experience. To George, his son's testimony only seemed to strengthen the neighbor's vampire theory. However, George told the older woman that he wanted proof that this really is what was going on, that a vampire was behind what was happening to his family. And so the older woman called over another one of the neighbors, a farmer that George sometimes shared crops with, and he told George and Dr. Metcalf that he'd seen cases like this before. He explained that sometimes when a person died, a dark supernatural force would take over their body and cause them to leech the life out of their surviving loved ones, even from beyond the grave. These people were not really dead, the farmer said. They were vampires. At this point, the older woman interrupted the farmer and said to figure out which one of George's deceased family members was the vampire, all they had to do was exhume the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters. if one of the women's bodies hadn't yet decomposed, or if her heart still contained blood, that was a telltale sign that she was the vampire. To George, this whole process sounded barbaric, and he couldn't bear the thought of seeing his wife and children's decomposing bodies. But for all he knew, his neighbors could be right, and this could be his only chance to save his only son. So George gave the neighbors his blessing to go dig up his family members' bodies, and then George turned to Dr. Metcalf and, said he couldn't go and see this, and so asked the doctor to please go to the graveyard on his behalf. That way the doctor could be his eyes and also be the voice of reason. A few minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trudged through the dirt, lagging behind the neighbors, as they made their way toward the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Between the 7 of them, they had 3 small lanterns, one of which Dr. Metcalf was holding to light his way. As the doctor walked along, he could hear the neighbors up ahead of him whispering about this vampire and what they were going to do, and it was hard for the doctor not to feel totally annoyed because he did not believe a curse was behind what was happening to George's family. But he reminded himself that George was utterly desperate and had really kind of convinced himself that maybe this curse really was the thing, and Dr. Metcalf didn't have the heart to just completely shoot it down. And so if this is what it took, going along with the neighbors to the graveyard to prove that George's son Edwin was not suffering from some kind of ridiculous curse, then ultimately this was worth it. Eventually, the neighbors and the doctor reached the cemetery's iron gates, which creaked as the farmer pushed them open. To the right of the entrance, Dr. Metcalf could see a stone crypt, and next to it, he could see the Brown family's plot. And it didn't take long for the group to locate the tombstones they were looking for. Dr. Metcalf stood a few feet away and watched while 2 of the neighbors held up lanterns and 3 others stuck shovels into George's wife's grave. They threw dirt to the side until eventually they unearthed her wooden coffin. The leader of the neighbors, the older woman who brought up the vampire curse, unlatched the casket, pulled it open, and revealed the dusty skeleton of George's late wife. She'd been dead for 9 years, and so her body had, like Dr. Metcalf had expected, totally decomposed. To the neighbors, though, this only meant that George's wife was not the vampire, but one of the 2 daughters was. So they reburied the wife and dug up George's first daughter, the one who had died just a few months after George's wife. And again, when they opened up the coffin, it was just full of bones, and so they reburied the daughter as well. And then finally, the neighbors exhumed Mercy, the second daughter, who had died just 8 weeks earlier. And what they found inside of her casket struck even Dr. Metcalf, the most skeptical person there, as absolutely inexplicable. Despite having been dead for 2 full months by this point, Mercy's body had not even begun to decompose. And to make things even stranger, Mercy's body was lying on its side, as if she had literally turned over in her grave after being buried. The gray-haired woman turned to Dr. Metcalf and pointed and said, "Look, there's your vampire." The doctor, who was admittedly kind of shaken up, still insisted there had to be some kind of rational medical explanation for this, but the neighbors wouldn't listen. They had already begun performing a ritual that they believed would kill the vampire, break the curse, and save Edwin's life. The neighbors gathered up twigs and arranged them on top of a nearby boulder. Then the farmer flicked a match and kindled the flame into a small bonfire. And then Dr. Metcalf watched in stunned silence as the older woman pulled something out of a bag that she'd carried into the cemetery. And in the flickering light, he saw a flash of silver, and he realized what the woman had pulled from her bag was a huge kitchen knife. And then Dr. Metcalf looked on in horror as the woman stuck that blade directly into Mercy's abdomen, slicing her stomach open, and then the woman reached up under Mercy's ribs and pulled out her liver and her heart. And then after opening them up, both organs were indeed still full of coagulated blood, as though Mercy's body had been using these organs recently. At this point, the old woman placed Mercy's organs on top of the fire and let them burn down to ash. But after that, the ritual was not done. The older woman pulled something else out of her bag. It was a jar full of water, and she unscrewed the cap. Then she scooped the ashes of the organs and put them into this water, then closed the jar and shook up the contents. The woman said the ritual was almost complete. All they needed to do now was have Edwin drink this entire concoction of water and his sister's burned organs. The neighbors turned and began marching out of the cemetery, and Dr. Metcalf, who was still just shocked by everything he had just seen, kind of chased after them, begging them to stop, but none of them even looked back. they were on a mission. A little while later that evening, Edwin was propped up in bed feeling lifeless and miserable, surrounded by his father, Dr. Metcalf, and the group of neighbors. Edwin held the jar of black liquid in his hands, but he hadn't drunk any of it yet. Instead, he listened as Dr. Metcalf and the older woman argued. Dr. Metcalf said that if Edwin drank that, it would only make him sicker. But the older woman insisted it was the only medicine that would cure him. Edwin looked to his father for some advice about what to do, but George told Edwin it was up to him. Staring at the watery ashes of his own sister's heart and liver, Edwin almost began to gag. He couldn't decide what to do. If he drank this vile liquid, he could die, but if he didn't drink it, he would still very likely die. So he ultimately decided he had nothing to lose. He unscrewed the jar's cap, brought the black water to his lips, and began to drink. But despite drinking his sister's burned liver and heart, 2 months after this ritual, Edwin still died of the White Death. The ritual had not worked. And after losing his only son, George Brown's life continued to get worse. Over the next 6 years, 3 more of his daughters would die of the White Death, leaving him with only one child, his daughter Hattie. George lived another 2 decades. However, his one remaining child, Hattie, would outlive George by about another 40 years. She would die in 1954, but she lived long enough to actually see a cure developed for the White Death, because it would turn out the White Death was not some curse caused by a vampire. It was actually a very common and very deadly infectious disease called tuberculosis, and by 1954, a vaccine had been developed. But back in the late 1800s, tuberculosis was a global epidemic. It was highly infectious, often spreading amongst families or other tight-knit social groups, and it accounted for 25% of all deaths in the northeastern United States, where the Brown family lived. But despite how common it was, tuberculosis was very poorly understood. There were many different types, and the symptoms could vary widely, so it wasn't always accurately diagnosed. And even when it was, there was no effective medications, so treatment was mostly guesswork. Although almost everyone in New England at the time knew someone who had died of tuberculosis, the Brown family had a uniquely horrible experience. They lived in an isolated, half-abandoned community where superstition reigned. So when they started coming down with the so-called White Death, which was a nickname for tuberculosis, their neighbors thought they'd become the victim of a vampire, and when they exhumed Mercy and found that her body had not decomposed, they took that as proof that she possessed supernatural powers and was behind the curse. But just like Dr. Metcalf suspected on the night where they exhumed her, there actually was a rational explanation for why Mercy's body had not decomposed. Mercy died in the middle of the harsh New England winter, when the ground was so frozen that it would have been impossible to actually dig a grave. So instead of being buried underground in the cemetery next to her mother and sister, she was still buried in the cemetery, but above ground in that stone crypt, where her body was naturally frozen and preserved. As for why her body appeared to have rolled over inside of her coffin, that was most likely because the neighbors had moved the casket as they opened it and sort of accidentally shifted her remains. However, Mercy's reputation as a vampire lived on, and her story made headlines all across the country, and in fact, in 1896, one article about Mercy the vampire made it into the hands of an aspiring novelist named Bram Stoker. He would release Dracula 1 year later, and the book featured a young woman who was turned into a vampire and later had her body exhumed. The character's name was Lucy, a combination of Mercy and her middle name, which was Lena. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories: we do sometimes use aliases because we don't know the names of the real people involved. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said in these stories, but everything is based on research. And also a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Our coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson.
For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt, script editing by Scott Allen and Evan Allen, our coordinating producer is Samantha Collins, production support by Avery Siegel, executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and also Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando, senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr, our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.
Hey, it's Mr. Ballin here. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series. Whether you're new to Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body.
A man in his 40s was sitting in a cafe, munching on a ham and cheese sandwich for lunch. Now, usually, the man had more lavish lunches, but today he was in a hurry to get back to work, and this was all the cafe offered. But then, the most wonderful smell filled the air. The man inhaled deeply, enjoying the heavenly aroma of whatever this food was. It smelled like this incredible hot dish. He looked around to see which table the smell was coming from, but as he scanned the restaurant, all he saw were other patrons eating basically simple sandwiches, just like him. And then he remembered, this cafe didn't even serve hot meals. But at the same time, he realized he knew that scent from his childhood. It was the smell of the delicious Spanish fried eggs that his mother used to make, called huevos rotos. This was not the man's first phantom smell. A few weeks ago, his apartment had filled with the amazing aroma of his mother's cooking, completely out of nowhere. But now, in this cafe, just like that time in his apartment, the sweet smell suddenly turned sour. The man could taste something metallic in his mouth, and the foul odor of sour milk lingered in the air, making him gag. And so suddenly, a wave of panic crept over the man. He didn't know why he kept smelling things that weren't there. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, ask the follow button to go on a long hike with you, but before you go, superglue a tiny pebble inside one of their shoes. It's common wisdom that diet and exercise are the best ways to maintain your health. As they say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But sometimes, no matter how fanatical you are about counting calories and getting daily exercise, there's just nothing you can do to keep certain illnesses at bay. And on this episode, we have two stories about extremely healthy people who find themselves fighting off strange, deadly conditions. The first story is about a marathon runner who suddenly goes through a drastic lifestyle change with no explanation. And the second and final story is about an active older woman who unexpectedly finds herself in the hospital, with doctors struggling to figure out what's wrong with her before it's too late. And now here's our first story called No Reservations. On a sunny morning in 1993, 42-year-old Roberto Nunez was on his daily run through his hometown of Granada, Spain. And as usual, along this route, he ran past delivery trucks parked outside of restaurants, and kitchen workers carried crates of food from these trucks into the back of the restaurants to prepare for the day's meals. Now, Roberto had never really paid these restaurants much attention. He was an athlete, and to him, food was just fuel, not some delicacy. But that morning, right after passing by the restaurant and smelling the smells of the food, he happened to run past a local bookshop.
and for whatever reason, something in that bookshop caught his eye. It was a fine dining cookbook, beautifully displayed in the front window. And for some reason, Roberto stopped his run and just stared at this cookbook. Something about the meal on the cover just looked irresistible. He was so drawn to it, he could almost taste the food in his mouth. Moments later, Roberto found himself inside the bookstore, asking for a copy of that book. As the shopkeeper went to go get a copy of this book, Roberto wandered toward the culinary section of the store and began flipping through the other cookbooks. And by the time the shopkeeper returned, Roberto had a whole pile of them in his arms. When Roberto left the bookshop, he couldn't run anymore because of how heavy all these books were he'd just bought, and so he walked his way home. And then when he got home, he lined up all of his beautiful new cookbooks on his kitchen counter and just stared for a second, marveling at all the food on the covers. Then he went to his refrigerator to grab a container of yogurt, his usual breakfast. But now, as he stared down at the cup of plain, unflavored goop, his tongue seemed to recoil inside of his mouth. He felt like he could almost taste the plastic container and metal spoon before he even took a bite. Suddenly, Roberto's everyday breakfast seemed totally unappealing. And so for the first time in his entire adult life, Roberto decided to take himself out for breakfast. He walked to the nearest open cafe and read their extensive menu, and all the items sounded delicious. Unable to choose, he just asked the server to bring him the most popular dish and one of every side dish on the menu. 20 minutes later, Roberto's little cafe table was so full of plates, he could barely find a spot to set down his espresso mug. Roberto stuck his fork into a potato omelet seasoned with chives and garlic. He took a bite, and it felt like his tongue was exploding with pleasure. He'd had all these foods before, but they had never triggered a response like this. He felt a rush of joy as he leaned over his cafe table and devoured every bit of food his stomach could fit. A few weeks later, Roberto was pacing in his kitchen on the phone, making reservations at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Granada. For the past couple of weeks, he and his wife had been eating out for almost every meal. Roberto didn't know what had come over him. He'd never been a food person, but now he was spending nearly all his time researching the best restaurants in Granada and then making plans to dine at each of them. Meanwhile, his running shoes sat abandoned in his closet. In fact, he hadn't gone running even once this week. Roberto was a marathon runner, but his heart just was not in running anymore. He'd totally stopped counting calories and monitoring his carbohydrate and protein intake. His only long-term goal at the moment was a grand European road trip so he could try all the famous restaurants he'd been reading about. In fact, calling a travel agent was the next item on his to-do list. He intended to eat at every single Michelin-rated restaurant in the entire world. Roberto finalized another restaurant reservation and then hung up, marking the appointment on his calendar, and then he called the next restaurant on his list. 4 years later, Roberto sat at his computer typing up a restaurant review. By this point, his entire life now revolved around food. Every free second was spent eating, planning to eat, or traveling to the best restaurants all over the world so that he could write about them. Roberto looked a lot different now, too. Roberto had really not been running at all over the past few years, and between that and his sedentary lifestyle and new love of gourmet food, he'd gained a good 60 pounds. He'd had to buy a completely new wardrobe, but Roberto didn't mind. He'd actually never had so much fun in his life as he had now, being a foodie. The passion he now felt for food rivaled the sense of accomplishment he used to feel at the end of marathons. It was like he had finally found his real life's purpose. Roberto sat back in his home office chair and closed his eyes, trying to remember the subtlety of a glaze he'd tasted at lunch. He breathed in deeply, then sat up looking around. He breathed in again, and a warm, savory scent filled his nostrils. His entire apartment was suddenly filled with this heavenly aroma, even though he wasn't cooking anything at all. It took him a minute to place this wonderful smell, and then he had it. It was his mother's cooking, a spicy potato dish she used to make him when he was a kid. Confused, Roberto went to the kitchen, wondering if maybe his wife had come home and started making dinner without him noticing, but no, the kitchen was dark and empty. So Roberto wandered the house, running scenarios through his mind that might explain the smell. At first he thought, maybe a window was open and outside smells were coming in. But when that wasn't true, he began to wonder, did somebody break in and were they eating inside of his house? Now he knew that made no sense, but the more he wandered the house, the stronger the smell of his mother's cooking became, but there was no reason for it to be in his apartment. It just made no sense. Roberto was feeling freaked out, especially when, moments later, the smell changed from delicious to sour. He stopped and covered his nose as a chemical-like odor filled the apartment. But even with his nose covered, he could still smell it. Worse, he could taste it on his tongue. He gagged a little, then went to the kitchen to spit in the sink. He flung a window open, trying to air out the smell, and then as quickly as the smell had come on, it disappeared. Roberto stood in his living room feeling very unnerved, trying to tell himself that there had to be some rational explanation here. He told himself that it must have been a neighbor cooking a familiar recipe and accidentally burning it on the stove. But despite his best efforts to convince himself that that really happened, he still felt very unsettled as he went back to his computer to finish his review. A month later, Roberto was at a local cafe enjoying one of his favorite breakfasts, a potato and chorizo omelet with a side of fruit and some bread. He'd just finished slathering the bread with some butter when his nose caught a whiff of that same savory scent he had smelled inside of his apartment. The smell was his mother's cooking, specifically her huevos rotos, a traditional Spanish breakfast she used to make when he was a kid. Roberto looked around, wondering if the smell was coming from a neighboring table, but he was the only one with a plate of food. Roberto picked up his espresso and breathed in deeply, knowing the smell of coffee beans can clear your palate. But when he set the cup down again, that smell was still there. Roberto told himself not to panic, but he was worried. He decided that perhaps it was time to see a doctor about all these phantom smells. A few days later, Roberto was at a neurologist's office explaining how he was smelling all these things that weren't actually there, and he was concerned that he was losing his mind. Now, the neurologist didn't want Roberto to panic, but he did think Roberto might be experiencing smell hallucinations, and they're rare, but very real, and they can be the sign of something dangerous. The doctor explained that smell hallucinations can be caused by head injuries, upper respiratory infections, and in some cases, brain tumors or Parkinson's disease. Roberto did his best to stay calm. He didn't know what he'd been expecting when he got here today, but certainly not being told he could have a brain tumor or Parkinson's disease. The neurologist could clearly read the fear in Roberto's eyes, because he immediately told him, don't worry, they'd run some tests and narrow down the possibilities, then figure out what was going on. They'd start by ordering an MRI. Roberto nodded, still feeling very uneasy. And a few hours later, his unease quickly turned to fear as the neurologist showed Roberto his MRI scan and pointed to a long, slender tumor on his right temporal lobe of his brain. Roberto felt petrified as the neurologist explained that the tumor was called a fibroblastic meningioma. It was putting pressure on Roberto's brain and causing him to have these smell hallucinations. The doctor explained that they'd have to surgically remove this tumor. Roberto felt a surge of adrenaline as he imagined himself undergoing brain surgery. He was going to be sick. He bent over, his arms on his knees, trying to catch his breath. And at the same time, the neurologist assured him that they would take very good care of him. The doctor said he would be with Roberto every step of the way. Roberto stood up and nodded. He knew he needed to call his wife and break the terrible news. But then after that, he would call his favorite restaurant to get takeout for dinner. He was in the mood for some comfort food. A few weeks later, Roberto was at home on his couch watching his favorite cooking show on TV. His head was still bandaged from his 14-hour brain surgery, which his neurologist said had been a success, and Roberto had been making slow but steady progress in his recovery. As he flipped through the channels, the mouth-watering smell of roasted chicken suddenly filled the room. And for a second, Roberto was terrified. Was this another smell hallucination? Did the surgery not work? But then he looked up and saw his wife enter the living room carrying 2 plates of roasted chicken, his dinner. His stomach rumbled, and he thanked his wife as she set his plate down on the coffee table and helped him sit upright. Roberto had not had a single smell hallucination since his surgery, and he was hoping that that meant he was cured. And so feeling like he had a new lease on life, Roberto looked forward to getting back to his food blog and the long list of restaurants he still wanted to try. 12 years later, on March 3, 2010, Roberto, who was now 58 years old, stood on the scale at his neurologist's office for a routine follow-up. Even though it had been over a decade since his brain surgery, he still had to get regular MRI scans to make sure there was no new tumors in his brain. The nurse took note of Roberto's weight. By this point, Roberto had gained approximately 110 pounds since he first took an interest in food. But this just didn't really bother him. He knew he'd been gaining weight steadily over the years, because after all, he ate rich and decadent foods for almost every meal, something he just loved to do. And besides, his career in food had really become quite incredible. Roberto was now a widely recognized and respected food critic. He wrote for prestigious magazines and gastronomy guides, and had been featured in a few newspapers. After that day's scan, Roberto waited inside of his neurologist's office, expecting the same results he got after every other appointment, all clear and good to go. Except this afternoon, his neurologist did not look too happy when he came through the door. He told Roberto that the MRI today showed a growing lesion and mild damage in the same areas where his tumor had been, and he believed that the lesion was likely left over from his surgery a decade ago. Roberto was shocked and asked the doctor if this meant more brain surgery. But the neurologist assured Roberto that this lesion was small. So small, in fact, they could very likely manage it without having to resort to surgery. Instead, they would do something called radiosurgery, which is when very focused beams of radiation are used to treat cancer cells in other tissue without any incision. Roberto liked the sound of that and scheduled the radiosurgery for later that week. A month later, Roberto parked his car along a street in Granada and adjusted his tie. Then he opened the passenger door for his wife, and the two of them began walking up the sidewalk on their way to a restaurant opening. And as they strolled along the boulevard, Roberto told his wife the good news. He'd had a follow-up doctor's appointment at his neurologist that afternoon. He'd completed his radiosurgery appointments at the start of the month, and now his neurologist told him that his lesion had shrunk by more than 25% and was no longer pressing on his temporal lobe. His neurologist felt optimistic that the lesion would soon be gone, and Roberto would be in full remission. As they neared the restaurant, Roberto's wife gave him a kiss and told him this was fantastic news. She was so relieved. Then the hostess led Roberto and his wife to their table and removed the shiny gold reserved placard as they sat down. The new restaurant was buzzing with anticipation. It was chock full of well-dressed diners, all clearly looking forward to an excellent night of food. A server came out to pour wine, and moments later, Roberto's first course was set down in front of him. But for some reason, it didn't look appetizing. He stared down at the food, trying to conjure some of the excitement he'd been feeling just moments ago, but he couldn't have been less interested. In fact, he kind of just wanted to leave and go home and get a good night's sleep. But Roberto was a professional, so he made himself eat every course they brought out to him. However, later that night, when he was working on the review, Roberto had to admit that his heart just wasn't in it. And so for the first time in more than 15 years, food just didn't really interest him. And the next time Roberto saw his neurologist, he learned why. It would turn out the tumor and lingering lesion pressing on Roberto's temporal lobe, known as the amygdala, was what had caused not only his hallucinatory smells, but his extreme interest in food. The pressure from the tumor created a brain injury, which in very rare cases can trigger a bizarre brain and eating disorder called gourmand syndrome. People who suffer from this condition can literally become completely obsessed with fine dining. They become preoccupied with food and sometimes become compulsive eaters, even if they had formerly been very health conscious. And that's exactly what happened to Roberto. Once Roberto's tumor was removed and the lesion was finally reduced, Roberto's love for food basically completely faded. However, despite that, Roberto did not give up on his career. He kept working as a food critic, even if his job was not nearly as enjoyable as it was before. And now, here is our second and final story of today's episode, called The Bitter End. One morning in 2022, a 64-year-old woman named Beth shuffled into her kitchen in Ontario, Canada. It was early, and so Beth was still wearing her pajamas. She opened up her kitchen window to let fresh air blow inside, and as she did, she took in a deep breath and smiled. Beth always reminded herself not to take life's small pleasures, like a cool summer breeze, for granted. She grabbed a loaf of whole wheat bread off the counter and put 2 slices in the toaster. Then she opened her fridge and pulled out a container of green juice and a couple of organic eggs. Beth was extremely health and diet conscious and usually had this same breakfast every morning. She drank 2 glasses of juice while her toast cooked, and she scrambled her eggs. Then she sat at the kitchen table to eat. When she finished, she put her dishes in the sink and walked back to her room to get dressed for her morning jog. But as she was trying to decide what shirt to wear, Beth felt this dull pain in her lower abdomen.
At first, she was able to ignore it, but then the pain got sharper and Beth suddenly was clutching her stomach. And then she felt weak, and a wave of nausea made her rush from her closet to her bathroom, where she vomited and then had diarrhea. Beth shakily walked to the sink and drank a few sips of water from the tap. When she looked in the mirror, she saw that her face was beet red. She could feel her heartbeat thudding in her throat, and so she brought 2 fingers up to her neck and began to count her pulse. And she found her heart was absolutely racing, and it really scared her because she had high blood pressure, and so she knew, at any point, something could go wrong with her heart. And so suddenly, Beth feared she might be having a heart attack. She stumbled back to her kitchen, she grabbed her landline phone off the counter, and she dialed 911. Less than half an hour later, Dr. Jacob Adams heard a siren blaring as an ambulance pulled up outside of the University of Ottawa's Montfort Hospital. A paramedic hopped out of the back of the vehicle and rushed into the emergency room, shouting to the doctor that, "Hey, we have a patient who's in shock here." And so Dr. Adams immediately ran with the paramedic out towards the ambulance, knowing he had a very sick patient on his hands. Shock occurs when a person doesn't have enough blood circulating throughout their body, and left untreated, it can rapidly lead to organ damage or even death. And this patient, Beth, was already in bad shape. The paramedic said that she was vomiting, she had diarrhea, and her blood pressure was dangerously high. Another paramedic followed closely behind the first, and together, they brought Beth into the emergency room on a gurney. Dr. Adams saw how pale and confused she looked, and knew there was no time to waste. He directed the EMT to wheel Beth into the nearest exam room, while the other paramedic briefed him on Beth's medical history. They told the doctor that Beth had been relatively healthy until today, but she had been taking medications for 2 conditions, high blood pressure and a thyroid deficiency that can leave patients feeling tired and looking pale. Otherwise, she was taking no other drugs. She didn't even take vitamins or over-the-counter supplements. The paramedic said Beth had deteriorated right before their eyes. When they first arrived at Beth's house, she was able to talk to them about her fear that she was maybe having a heart attack. But since then, she had gotten so much sicker that now she could barely talk. Dr. Adams nodded and thanked the paramedics for bringing her in. Then he watched as the ER nurses went to work on their very unstable patient. One nurse checked Beth's temperature, another inserted an IV needle, and a third wrapped a blood pressure monitor around her arm. At first, it showed that Beth's blood pressure was elevated, but suddenly, it plummeted 100 points. Beth's arms went limp, and she looked like she was struggling to breathe. And so within seconds, Beth's blood pressure had gone from being dangerously high to being so low that she could lose consciousness any second. Dr. Adams took one of Beth's hands and squeezed her fingers, making her skin turn white. He waited for the color where he squeezed to come back, but it took an unusually long time. To Dr. Adams, this was extremely worrying. It meant Beth's blood circulation had become dangerously sluggish. Before they could do anything else, Dr. Adams knew he would need to stabilize Beth's condition. He asked a nurse to start her on an IV fluid drip, and almost as soon as the fluids entered Beth's bloodstream, her blood pressure started rising and her breathing returned to normal. After a few minutes, Beth began to speak, albeit in a strained voice, saying that her stomach was killing her. She said she kept getting these horrible, sharp cramps in her lower abdomen. Dr. Adams assured Beth they would figure out what was going on, but they had to perform a lot of different tests as quickly as possible to do that. And so he told her the best thing she could do was try to stay calm and just focus on her breathing. Beth looked scared, but nodded her head in agreement. Then Dr. Adams called in 3 different medical technicians who all surrounded Beth. One of them took vials of her blood, another examined her abdomen with an ultrasound machine, while the third performed an EKG to test her heart function. Meanwhile, Dr. Adams stood off to the side and considered all of his patient's symptoms, and he began to think about a couple of different things that could have caused her to go into shock. Maybe she was having an allergic reaction, or maybe she swallowed some kind of poison, or maybe she was fighting a severe infection. Now, the first 2, allergic reaction and poison, were tough to address right now, but the severe infection could be treated right away. So Dr. Adams called for a nurse to start Beth on broad-spectrum antibiotics, hoping this would stop a potential infection in its tracks. While a nurse gave Beth a dose of antibiotics through her IV tube, one of the medical technicians finished taking Beth's blood. Dr. Adams told him to have the blood tested for signs of infection,
and also to run an emergency toxicology test to see if there were any traces of poison inside of Beth's body. At almost the same time, the ultrasound technician pulled up black and white images of Beth's digestive system onto a computer screen and told Dr. Adams that they didn't see anything out of the ordinary, like fluid buildup or a bowel obstruction. However, the technician who was doing the EKG had much more ominous news. They said the left side of Beth's heart was working much harder than it should have been, a sign that her heart was not functioning correctly. It could mean that the right side of her heart was failing, and so as a result, the left side was trying to make up for it, which Dr. Adams knew could easily put Beth's life in danger. But, alarming as the EKG results were, they didn't help Dr. Adams determine what was actually causing Beth's intense distress. He needed to get a better understanding of how all of her internal organs were functioning. So he decided to bring her into the radiology department for a CT scan, which would take pictures of the inside of her body. The scan only took about 15 minutes, but it revealed that Beth's problems went beyond her heart. Dr. Adams saw that her small intestine showed signs of inflammation or even a possible obstruction. Though the earlier ultrasound of her abdomen had looked normal, the doctor no longer believed that was accurate. He could tell from the more detailed CT scan that something was wrong after all. And suddenly, Dr. Adams had an alarming thought. Maybe Beth was bleeding internally inside of her digestive system. Severe internal bleeding could explain a lot of Beth's symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and her sudden drop in blood pressure. But this would be a terrifying diagnosis. If Dr. Adams didn't locate and stop the bleeding right away, Beth could bleed to death. A few minutes later, Dr. Adams received the results of Beth's blood work. Her toxicology report came back normal, meaning technicians had not found any poison in her system, but on the other hand, the results showed she did have elevated levels of a protein found in red blood cells, which did seem to indicate she did have internal bleeding. And just as the doctor set her test results aside, Beth's blood pressure suddenly plummeted again. She went pale and her breathing became labored. Dr. Adams looked up and noticed her IV fluid bag was empty, so he quickly replaced it with a full one, and as soon as the fluids flowed into her system, just like the last time, her blood pressure immediately stabilized. But to Dr. Adams, this was not a good sign. If Beth was rapidly bleeding internally, IV fluids would keep her going for a while, but eventually it would not be enough, and so she needed a blood transfusion as quickly as possible. And at this point, Beth looked sicker than ever. She groaned in pain and then leaned over the side of her hospital bed and vomited up blood. Now, Dr. Adams was certain that she was bleeding internally into her stomach, which was why she was throwing up the blood. He immediately called in a nurse, who began giving Beth a blood transfusion. He also continued giving her IV fluids and started her on drugs that would keep her blood pressure up and reduce acid in the stomach to hopefully slow the bleeding. After all that, Dr. Adams transferred Beth to the intensive care unit, where they met with a gastrointestinal specialist named Dr. Christina King. Dr. King said she needed to insert a tiny camera down Beth's throat and into her abdomen. That way, she could see firsthand where the blood was coming from. Dr. King turned to Beth, whose face was scrunched up in pain, and explained the procedure. Beth would be put under light anesthesia for about 30 minutes, and during that time, Dr. King would insert a tube with the camera on one end into Beth's esophagus and down into her stomach. Beth looked uneasy, but she was so sick that a tube going down her throat seemed like a small price to pay for some answers. She said okay, and the doctors got to work prepping her for the procedure. About 15 minutes later, Beth had been put under anesthesia and was lying on her side on a bed in her ICU room. Dr. King stood beside her and carefully inserted the long, thin tube down her throat. Dr. King could see the inside of Beth's esophagus on a screen right beside her bed. Dr. King moved the tube further down Beth's digestive system, and as soon as the camera entered Beth's stomach, Dr. King saw that her stomach lining was swollen, red, and bleeding. The bleeding was not severe, but the doctor knew that was only thanks to the drugs that Dr. Adams had given Beth. Later that afternoon, Dr. King sat in the ICU with Beth, who was still sedated from her procedure. Beth did look much better than she had just a few hours ago, and Dr. King was glad that the treatment she and Dr. Adams had come up with seemed to be working. Her internal bleeding had largely stopped, at least for now, and so for the time being, Dr. King could really focus on why Beth was bleeding internally. Dr. King was starting to think that Beth's illness had been caused by something that she might have eaten rather than by poison or an infection. And so once Beth woke up from her procedure, Dr. King asked her if she'd eaten anything out of the ordinary that morning before she'd gotten sick. Beth initially said no. She'd had the same breakfast she ate every single morning: whole wheat toast, organic eggs, and homemade green juice. However, Beth said, now that she thought about it, her juice had tasted a bit more bitter than usual. Dr. King asked what kind of juice it was, and Beth said, she made it herself from a type of green squash called bottle gourds that she had bought at the store. She'd heard that bottle gourds were really great health food, and so for the last several years, she'd been pureeing the vegetables into a juice that she would drink every morning. Dr. King just stared at Beth, because suddenly she knew what was going on with Beth, and it made perfect sense. Beth had given herself a nearly fatal case of toxic squash syndrome. It's a very rare condition that results from eating poisonous chemicals sometimes found in squashes and gourds. These toxins are called cucurbitacins, and they taste very bitter. Over hundreds of years, people have bred squashes to have only trace levels of these toxins. But sometimes the plants can still develop high amounts of cucurbitacins as they grow. And people who eat a lot of those types of vegetables can get dangerously ill. Beth went to her local grocery store and unknowingly bought bottle gourds that did contain a dangerous amount of these toxins. Then she pureed the vegetables and drank the juice, and the only thing she noticed was a slightly bitter taste, until just minutes after breakfast, the toxins caused her stomach lining to start bleeding, and Beth went into shock. Her case was the first of its kind ever reported in Canada. After 5 days in the ICU, Beth was finally healthy enough to return home. 2 weeks later, her doctors called to check on her condition, and she told them that she was feeling fine, except for one symptom. In the past few days, her hair had begun falling out. Her doctors told her that this was actually normal. Delayed onset hair loss had been reported in a number of cases of toxic squash syndrome. Despite her hair loss, which was actually only temporary, Beth would go on to make a full recovery and go back to her normal life. Though she found another kind of juice to drink at breakfast. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories: we do sometimes use aliases because we don't know the names of the real people involved. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said in these stories, but everything is based on research. And also a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lan and Karis Allen Pash-Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Our senior managing producer is Nick Ryan. And our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Samantha Collins. Production support by Avery Siegel. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and also Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.
Hey, it's Mr. Ballin here. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you should check out my other podcast, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. Each week, I dive into some of the most bizarre, mind-bending medical stories you've ever heard. Cases that leave doctors scratching their heads, miraculous recoveries that defy logic, and strange medical mishaps that seem too wild to be real. These stories are more than just eerie. They are a reminder of how unpredictable and sometimes terrifying life can be. Up next is one of my recent favorites from the series. Whether you're new to Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries or a longtime listener, I think you'll find it just as captivating as I did. If you like this content, make sure to follow Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. We put out new episodes every week, and each one dives into a bizarre, mind-bending medical mystery that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the human body. On a cold January morning, a fire captain zigzagged through an upscale neighborhood in Washington, D.C. As the fire truck sped past stately homes and manicured mansions, the captain could see people peering out their windows. In a quiet area like this, the sound of sirens was infrequent and unusual. And today, the call that the fire captain and his crew were responding to was something even they rarely had to address. Because this call wasn't in response to a fire or a traffic accident or even a cat stuck in a tree. But the woman who called 911 sounded terrified, and she begged the dispatcher to send help right away. 6 lives depended on it. Now, the fire captain pushed himself to focus and concentrate on the dangerous task ahead. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, kindly offer to babysit for the follow button, and then right before the follow button comes home at bedtime, make sure to feed all their kids tons of sugar. This episode is called False Alarm. On the morning of December 18th, 2020, 50-year-old Brooke Stroud wandered into her spacious kitchen in Washington, D.C., where she lived with her husband, Stefan, and their 3 young adult children. Brooke shook her head and tried to concentrate as she searched for the cup of coffee she'd brewed earlier. She hadn't been herself the last few days. Her head felt foggy, and little things, like where she'd put her coffee, had been slipping her mind. Brooke spotted the cup in a corner right near their large Viking stove. She grabbed it and headed out of the kitchen and into the formal living room. She slipped on a jacket and went out to the backyard, making a beeline for the separate guest house where she'd set up a home office. It was 9 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, and most businesses all over the country were shut down. Brooke was a clinical psychologist, and she had switched all her in-person sessions to Zoom. This morning, she had a group call, so she set her mug down at her wooden desk, turned on her laptop, and logged into her meeting. As Brooke said hello to the other participants, a wave of exhaustion suddenly washed over her. Her head felt heavy, and every bone in her body was suddenly aching. A scary thought crossed Brooke's mind. Maybe she'd finally gotten COVID, a disease that had already killed 350,000 people in the United States alone. She tried to power through the meeting, but all she could think about was how awful she felt. And so after only a few minutes of being in this meeting, she told everybody on the call that she just wasn't feeling well and asked if they could actually reschedule. After logging out of the Zoom call, Brooke took a minute to collect herself. She didn't think her symptoms seemed like COVID, so she wondered if maybe she was just overdoing it and was maybe tired from the stress of her job. She loved her work, but her hours have been crazy since the pandemic started. More people than ever were turning to therapy to get through these very difficult times. So she decided to cancel the rest of her sessions for the day and just go get some rest. She took the familiar path out of the guest house, through the backyard, and into the main house, walking more slowly than usual. Brooke climbed the winding staircase up to the second floor and into the master bedroom. There she climbed into bed, hoping to sleep off her weariness. Hours later, around noon, Brooke blinked her eyes open. Groggily, she sat up and felt around the bed. Her crisp white sheets were now totally damp with sweat. Brooke touched her forehead and realized she was burning up. She stumbled out of her bed and into the bathroom to take her temperature, and she saw it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and so she knew she was officially sick. Brooke tried to figure out what to do. She needed to get herself tested for COVID as soon as possible, but at-home COVID tests were not available at this time, which meant she'd have to set up an appointment with her doctor. Until she had the results, she could stay in her bedroom to avoid infecting her family potentially, but then she realized it was likely too late to actually isolate herself. Her youngest kids, 19-year-old Alex and 17-year-old Olivia, had come home from college and boarding school for the holidays a few days earlier, and they were probably already exposed to whatever Brooke had. So she decided it likely made the most sense to just kind of go about her day as usual, but at the same time, try to keep her distance from the kids and her husband. So Brooke put her hair up in a messy bun and headed downstairs. A few hours later, Brooke gathered everyone for dinner. She sat at one end of their long table, while Stefan and the kids were at the other. Brooke wasn't up to cooking, so she ordered takeout from an Italian place, and the table was overflowing with pastas and salads. Alex and Olivia piled their plates high.
They always had big appetites when they came home after months of school cafeteria food. Brooke was glad to see her kids eating, but for her, her fever was still burning, and she felt barely hungry at all. She pushed her pasta around her plate as her kids talked about what their semesters had been like with all the COVID protocols. Alex went to college in North Carolina, and Olivia was a high school senior at the same all-girls boarding school in Virginia that Brooke had actually attended. Brooke's oldest child, Sebastian, went to college in Vermont and wouldn't be home for a few days. Brooke really hoped she'd feel better by then, so they could all spend the holidays together, stress-free. Alex looked excited as he told them all about school, but Brooke could see the sadness in Olivia's eyes as she talked about the way COVID restrictions had basically ruined campus life. Normally, she played on a few different sports teams, but the pandemic had put all of them on hold. Brooke felt sorry for Olivia. Even though the pandemic was hurting everybody, she knew her daughter was having an especially hard time. She had looked forward to being a senior for so long, and now that she was, everything seemed to be falling apart. But Brooke's job was to be Olivia's mom, not her therapist, and they were all trying to figure out how to adjust to this new normal. After everyone was done eating, Brooke suggested they watch an old Christmas movie. Brooke took a seat at the opposite end of the couch from Stefan and the kids, and then willed herself to stay awake. Even after napping for several hours that day, she was still exhausted. About halfway through the movie, Brooke noticed her husband massaging his temples, and he also had a strained look on his face. She asked him what was wrong, and he explained his head was pounding. Brooke suggested he go check his temperature. Maybe he had a fever too. They paused the TV, and Stefan headed upstairs, holding onto the banister for support. A few minutes later, Brooke heard him vomiting. So she mustered what little strength she had left and ran up to find him leaning over the toilet bowl. She rubbed Stefan's back, trying to soothe him, but then she heard Alex and Olivia yell for her. Brooke told her husband she'd be right back, and she retraced her footsteps back to the living room. There, she found Alex and Olivia lying on the couch, clutching their heads in their hands as well. They complained that they also had terrible headaches. Brooke turned to go get them some water from the kitchen, while Alex shot up from the couch and ran to the guest bathroom. A second later, Brooke heard him retching too. And as if on cue, Olivia started dry heaving as well. Brooke ran to the kitchen at this point and grabbed a trash can, and she made it back to the living room just in time to set the bin in front of her daughter as she threw up all of her dinner. The following afternoon, Brooke and Stefan sat next to each other inside of a small exam room at their family doctor's office. Brooke had woken up that morning feeling like she'd barely gotten any sleep, even though she'd slept through the entire night, and the rest of her family felt just as bad. So Brooke had decided to get herself and Stefan checked for COVID. Brooke pulled her mask down under her nose, leaving just enough room for the nurse to insert a long nasal swab into her left nostril. It went so far back that it felt like Brooke's brain was being tickled. Her eyes teared up at the sensation, and she stifled a sneeze. The nurse rotated the swab around her nose for several seconds until it was coated with fluid, and then she repeated the same thing in Brooke's right nostril. And then she did the whole process all over again for Stefan. The nurse explained it would take about 24 hours for them to receive the test results by email. Then she took the swabs and left the room, while Brooke and Stefan checked out at the front desk. The next day, December 20th, 2020, Brooke stared at an email she had gotten from her doctor on her phone. She and Stefan were both negative for COVID, which was great, but they still felt horrible, and so clearly they were sick with something. Brooke decided to call Alex and Olivia's pediatrician to see if the kids should get tested for COVID too. But their doctor explained that it probably didn't make sense since Brooke and Stefan already tested negative. Whatever germs they had would have already infected the kids, but very, very likely it was not COVID. So the doctor recommended that everybody in the family just stay home, get some rest, drink lots of fluids, and surely this whole thing will just pass. However, a few days later, Brooke woke up aching all over still. Her fever had stayed steady at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, clouding her mind. The rest of her family felt just as bad too. Their headaches had never really gone away, and some mornings they still woke up feeling very nauseous. But Brooke fought through the fatigue and dragged herself out to her office in the guest house. She knew she was supposed to focus on resting and powering up her immune system, but she felt a responsibility to her clients. Her family was not the only one struggling right now during this weird holiday season. So Brooke settled in at her desk and logged into her first Zoom call. And as she took notes and chatted with other clients throughout the day, she felt herself perk up a bit. Slowly, her headache subsided, and the exhaustion that had usually overpowered her these last few days began to lift. Brooke thought about how good it felt to focus on other people for a change. Around 5 p.m., she wrapped up her sessions and made her way back to the house. She felt optimistic for the first time in a while that maybe she was finally getting over this illness. And so, Brooke, feeling really good, decided she would surprise the family by cooking a nice dinner. An hour later, Brooke called her whole family over to the dining room. She'd grilled some nice, thick steaks, figuring they could all use the protein. Brooke smiled as she doled out plates of food, silently telling herself that they would all be better by Christmas. She'd gotten sick before everybody else, so it made sense that she was recovering sooner too. But as Brooke took a bite of this food she made, she suddenly felt all that heaviness in her head and body start to creep back in. She told herself it was nothing, ignoring the queasiness that was growing in her stomach, and she managed to swallow a few bites of food before she just gave up. And she could see that the rest of her family also could not stomach their food either. Brooke watched Olivia push her salad around listlessly. She was usually so bubbly and full of life, but tonight, just like the rest of them, she looked defeated. Brooke sighed and began clearing their plates covered with uneaten food. After cleaning up, it took all the strength she had left just to shuffle upstairs and fall into her bed. The next afternoon, December 23rd, Brooke heard the front door open. She'd spent all morning in bed, but now she gathered the energy to limp down the stairs to the foyer, her muscles weak from this mystery illness and lack of physical activity. Her hair was matted, and she was wearing the same sweatpants and sweatshirt she'd been in for the past few days. But she managed a weak smile at the sight of her son, Sebastian, standing there with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, finally home from his college in Vermont. He looked fit and healthy, the rosiness in his cheeks a stark contrast to the paleness of her own face. She'd warned Sebastian that his family was not feeling well, but he joked that, nobody was feeling well these days. After all, it's the pandemic. And he said he would rather get sick at home than spend the holidays somewhere else without his family. Brooke stood at the bottom step, trying to keep her distance from her son, even as she told him how happy she was that he was home. But Sebastian just laughed and pulled her into a big bear hug. Brooke allowed him to wrap his arms around her, a sense of relief washing over her. A few hours later, the whole family sat in the living room eating cheese and crackers, while Sebastian told them all about his fall semester at college. As he described the off-campus house where he lived, Brooke saw Sebastian slowly sink into the couch, and his voice started to sound fatigued. She asked him if he felt okay, and Sebastian said he was just tired from finishing up his last paper for school and then catching a flight home. Brooke smiled and suggested he go to his room and get some rest. But inside, Brooke started worrying that Sebastian might be coming down with this same mystery illness that was dogging the rest of them. A couple of days after Christmas, Brooke's daughter Olivia woke up with a throbbing headache just as she had every morning since coming home. Her muscles still ached and she still didn't feel rested at all. In fact, it felt like she could sleep for another 5 hours, and even that probably wouldn't be enough. Olivia looked around her room, noticing all the tissues and dirty clothes she had scattered on the carpet. Usually she kept her space very nice and tidy, but she didn't have the energy or motivation to clean or do much of anything, really. So far, her winter break had been a total disaster. Olivia had expected the holidays to be different because of the COVID pandemic, but she'd hoped to have at least some fun. Now, the only silver lining was her upcoming trip to visit Caroline, her best friend from school who lived in New Orleans. Then, the plan was for them to fly back to DC together and spend 2 more weeks in isolation at Olivia's house. Their boarding school wanted all students to quarantine before returning for the spring semester, so they were going to do that together in DC. But Olivia was now worried that the family's mystery illness could ruin her visit to Caroline's house too. So Olivia asked her parents to please set up an appointment with her pediatrician that afternoon. If doctors could just figure out what was making her sick, maybe Olivia could get the right treatment in time to go visit her friend. The next day, Olivia sat down next to her very ragged-looking mom at the kitchen table. Brooke blew on the steaming cup of tea in front of her, cooling it down before taking a long sip. She had purple bags under her eyes and her hair was a total mess. Olivia obviously knew her mom was not feeling great, none of them were, but she needed her mom's attention right now. She gathered up her willpower, pushing away the nausea and exhaustion she felt, and reminded herself of the argument she'd practiced. She was determined to see her friend Caroline and get back to living her life. First, Olivia gave her mom a rundown of her visit to the pediatrician the previous day. Dr. Stein had given her a COVID test just to be safe, She also checked for parvovirus, which causes mild respiratory illness, and Epstein-Barr virus, a common illness that would be making Olivia very drowsy. Olivia explained to her mom that all the results had come back negative. Then, before Brooke could even respond, Olivia launched into the speech she'd prepared. She told her mother, since she didn't have any of those viruses or COVID, she should be able to go see Caroline. All she was doing here was sitting at the house and watching TV, and after saying this, Olivia just went quiet and watched her mom consider her words. She could see the wheels in her mother's mind turning, and for a moment, it seemed like her mom might actually agree with her. But before Olivia could celebrate her victory, her mom's face got serious, and she began to speak in a very soft voice. Brooke explained that she, Olivia, her daughter, was already sick, and she couldn't risk traveling and getting worse, even if she didn't know what the sickness was. Olivia immediately huffed in frustration and thought about arguing more with her mom, but as upsetting as this was, she knew her mom was right. She did feel terrible, and clearly whatever she had likely was contagious because her whole family had it. So Olivia turned and headed up the stairs to her bedroom, her breathing ragged and her spirits deflated. Brooke sighed as she heard Olivia kind of stomping around upstairs, obviously still very upset, and Brooke couldn't help but feel sorry for her teenage daughter. This holiday season wasn't what any of them were expecting, but it seemed like Olivia was really taking it the hardest. She thrived on interacting with people, and she had already been through a semester at school full of remote classes and social distancing because of COVID. This trip to New Orleans was supposed to be her big chance to go have some fun and explore a new city with a very close friend. Brooke wondered if there was anything she could do to salvage the rest of Olivia's break. She stood up from the couch, fighting off the dizziness that came whenever she moved too quickly, and just then a thought crossed her mind. Brooke grabbed her phone off the coffee table and made her way outside to the backyard and began looking through her contacts until she found the name John Schifflian, who was Caroline's dad. Brooke paced around the garden as she spoke to John, savoring the fresh air, and she explained to him what had been going on at her house and that unfortunately, Olivia was too sick to travel to New Orleans to see Caroline. Brooke was very clear that her whole family had the same bug as Olivia, and that doctors had been unable to figure out what it was, but they did eliminate COVID-19. It was not that. Then Brooke made her pitch to John. Instead of having her daughter Olivia fly to New Orleans, she suggested that Caroline come to stay with them in Washington, D.C. If Caroline came here, she and Olivia could spend time together and hole up in the house and do their required 2 weeks of quarantine before returning to school together. Now, Brooke knew that a lot of parents would immediately reject the idea of sending their child to a house where everybody is sick. But Caroline's father, John Schifflian, was no ordinary parent. He was an infectious disease specialist at Tulane University's medical school. He studied survivors of some of the world's worst infectious diseases, and probably had more information about COVID-19 than anyone else Brooke knew. And so if he was okay with Caroline coming to DC, Brooke was confident that it really was safe. After Brooke made her pitch, there was a few moments of awkward silence, and then John responded. It was widely understood that the longer somebody was sick, whether with COVID or something else, the less infectious the illness becomes to others. If Caroline visited, she likely wouldn't get sick at all, or she'd get a milder version of whatever Brooke's family had. Regardless, she wouldn't be in any significant danger. And also, John knew his daughter would totally go for this idea. She wanted to see her friend. And so ultimately, John agreed to the idea. Brooke thanked John and assured him that she'd do everything she could to make sure Caroline was safe. John thanked her, and then they hung up, and then Brooke practically ran into the house to tell her daughter the great news. A few days later, in early January of 2021, Brooke made her way to the front door of her house. Before she could reach for the handle, Olivia came bolting out of the kitchen and shooed her mom out of the way with more energy than Brooke had seen in weeks. Her daughter was practically jumping with excitement. Olivia threw open the door and immediately wrapped her arms around Caroline. As Brooke watched her daughter light up, she told herself this was the right decision. She turned to Caroline and told her she was welcome to take her mask off. She'd be here for the next 2 weeks anyway, and her dad was aware of the situation. Caroline and Olivia grinned at each other, then they took Caroline's bag and headed upstairs to Olivia's room. A few hours later, Brooke was sitting in the guest house catching up on her paperwork when her daughter Olivia came rushing inside. In a panicked voice, she explained that Caroline had a splitting headache and was currently in the bathroom throwing up. Brooke shot out of her chair, dizziness and anxiety bubbling up inside of her at the same time.
Brooke couldn't believe what she'd done. She'd promised John that his daughter would be safe here. Now she was just as sick as the rest of them. Brooke followed Olivia out of the guest house and back to the main house, fighting off dizzying vertigo with every step. The next evening, on January 5th, 2021, Brooke stood outside the bedroom where Caroline was staying. She was trying to figure out if Caroline was asleep or not. Brooke gently knocked, and a few seconds later, Caroline opened up. Brooke realized that Caroline was actually on a video call on her phone, and she quickly apologized, saying she could come back later. But Caroline said don't worry about it, she was on the phone with her dad. Seizing the opportunity, Brooke asked if she could speak to him for a second. Caroline handed over the phone, and Brooke told John she was absolutely mortified at the way his daughter's visit had gone so far. She repeated the apologies she'd been giving Caroline ever since she got sick. But John just waved her apology away. He said it was okay, he'd been the one who signed off on this trip, and he knew that the whole family was sick. And so Brooke felt her anxiety ease a little bit. At least John was not openly blaming her for what was going on with Caroline. However, John wasn't quite finished with his response. He did want to call to Brooke's attention something that Caroline had brought up to him, something very important. Caroline had told him that her symptoms lessened whenever the girls went for a walk around the neighborhood. She also said that people seemed to get very sick very quickly when they came into the main house. That suggested to John that this was not an infectious disease. John thought it was much more likely that it was some kind of environmental illness, meaning there was something in the house doing it. And John actually had a sneaking suspicion about which environmental illness it was. So he recommended that Brooke go to the hardware store as soon as possible. There she could buy a device that would prove John's theory. Brooke was shocked at what she was hearing, but she promised John she would go to the store first thing tomorrow morning, and then she passed the phone back to Caroline, anxious but excited that they might actually finally figure out what was making everybody sick. The next morning, January 6th, 2021, Stefan returned home from the hardware store with this new device in hand. Brooke grabbed her husband by the arm and rushed him inside, eager to see if Caroline's father had been right. She grabbed the device from Stefan and then hit the on button. And right away, the machine began blaring. The kids ran downstairs, shouting over the alarm to ask what was going on. Brooke pointed to the device and told Stefan to explain it to them as she fumbled with her phone. She very quickly dialed 911 and ran out into the yard, explaining to the dispatcher what was going on through panicked breaths. She pleaded with them to hurry. Within minutes, Brooke heard sirens. She rushed to the door and hurried the firefighters inside, showing them the device that was still going off. The uniformed men yelled over the alarm and instructed everyone to go outside and wait while they dealt with whatever was going on inside the house. Brooke ushered Stefan and the kids out the door and across the street. Pretty soon, curious neighbors were standing in small clusters all along the sidewalk, their eyes wide as they took in all the emergency vehicles before them. As they watched the commotion unfold, Brooke turned to Caroline and asked her to call her father. She wanted to tell John he was right. The firefighters would discover that Brooke's family had a serious carbon monoxide leak in their home, and everyone, including Caroline, had carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide, or CO for short, is an odorless, colorless gas that kills hundreds of people every year. When somebody has carbon monoxide poisoning, what happens is the carbon monoxide in the air replaces the oxygen in their bloodstream. As a result, the heart, brain, and body are starved of the oxygen they need to survive. The firefighters who responded to Brooke's call quickly figured out that the leak was coming from the basement furnace. A clamp had come loose and was spewing carbon monoxide throughout the 4-story house. That explained why Brooke felt better every time she worked in the guest house, and why Olivia and Caroline had fewer symptoms whenever they were out walking around in the neighborhood. Brooke was shocked that their smoke alarm already in the home didn't warn them about the poisonous gas exposure, but after inspecting the alarm, she realized it didn't have a CO detector at all. It had been installed a year before Washington, D.C. required them in all residences. In the end, Brooke's family and Caroline all recovered well from the CO poisoning. After the leak, Brooke bought 4 plug-in detectors that she installed on each level of the house, but every time she goes into the basement, she can't help but check to see that the furnace is still properly connected. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Natalie Pritzovsky. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins. And our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Peliconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Moore. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery.